This story is a suspenseful Western mystery set in a rugged mining town. Emily, a determined and desperate woman, and Barney, a sharp, resourceful man with a strong sense of justice, search for her missing father amid crime and corruption. Vanishing Gold by Clarence L. Andrews. The Thrill Book, July 1919. Chapter 1. The spink of cracked glass, followed by the vicious spat of metal striking wood, came without warning, an infinitesimal fraction of time before these tragic sounds broke the stillness. The man at Barney Donovan's desk inclined his head to look for a slip of paper which had strayed far back beneath the hood. Otherwise, the bit of death-dealing lead would not have struck the wall. As official assayer for the Malta Mining Company, Barney Donovan usually busied himself at that desk at that hour of the evening. Tonight he was in town, and Bart Carson, the mine superintendent, was searching through the contents while waiting Donovan's return. Had those sounds startled the ears of a man less wary than Carson, he might have glanced up in surprise, but to him that ominous signal smacked of older, bolder days, a forerunner of serious trouble. Keeping his face close to the desktop, he snapped off the light. Then, jerking an automatic from a drawer, he tiptoed to the window through which the bullet had entered. When his eyes became accustomed to the darkness, he made out a jagged hole in one of the lower panes. The window faced south, 100 yards away, and that many feet lower than the office, flowed Little Snake Creek.
Although there was no moon, the clear night rendered objects distinguishable for quite a distance, yet an intense study of the creek-bottom shadows failed to reveal anything unusual.
The front door faced east. He moved stealthily to his left and opened it. Without crossing the threshold, he listened for telltale sounds. All he heard was the croaking of frogs in a pool west of the office, and the faint rumble of stamps at the mill a quarter of a mile up the canyon. He closed the door and turned to the middle one of 3 doors which pierced the inner wall. On his right was the assayer's bedroom, on his left was the laboratory and furnace room. He opened the middle door, behind which was a closet containing the assay safe. Not 2 hours earlier, both he and Barney had weighed, checked, and stored $100,000 worth of gold bars in that safe. He groped for the bolt lever and tested it. It resisted his effort, and he was satisfied. He retraced his steps to the front door. Out on the tiny front porch he paused. Someone who used a strong pipe had just been at that spot or was lurking very close. The odor was such as an inveterate pipe smoker would have about his clothing. A lantern bobbed up and down a short distance up the path as the night watchman approached from the mill. Carson did not wait. Instead, he faced north and passed around the building, halting at each corner, alert, distrustful. Before he had completed the round, he heard the watchman stamp across the porch. The next moment, the brilliant glow of an incandescent lamp supplanted the lantern's puny glimmer within the office. The watchman filled and lighted a service-blackened corncob pipe, then settled back in the assayer's chair with an air of comfort. Carson eyed him speculatively through the broken window. Tall, loose-jointed, sour of face and disposition, with mottled gray eyes almost as deadly as his gnarled trigger finger. Cyanide Bill Sutter was of that type of taciturn guardians who shoot first and talk at the inquest. A grim, set look crept into Carson's face as he saw the watchman stare around the office in an attitude of listening. He began to wonder if Sutter had heard the shot. If so, the crafty grin on his seamed features betrayed anything else than official concern. Carson pondered the situation. Unaccountable accidents, of which the mysterious shot was the most recent, had been occurring with strange frequency of late. One thing only prevented him from attributing the shot to an enemy bent upon revenge. The assay safe contained the largest shipment of gold bullion on record for the Malta Company, and it was due out on the morning stage. And yet, all angles considered, Revenge presented the most likely reason, for the mine crews had no love for their superintendent. Just why was an unanswered question, though many surmised that he lacked personality, that indefinable quality which is essential in men of authority. His latest clash had been with Barney Donovan that morning, only for the opportune appearance of Emily Carson, his daughter. The quarrel would have ended in blows. Barney, who was 26, had boarded with Carson and his daughter for more than a year, and no good-looking, well-bred young man can daily associate with a lady of lesser years, whose admirable qualities include beauty, charm, and cooking, and not escape the inevitable results. Secretly, Carson did not approve of the match, but he never expressed his opinion openly until Barney pointed out some dubious features in the semi-annual mine report. Then Carson had flown into a towering rage. He was even unwise enough to drag the intimate friendship of Barney and Emily into the quarrel when Barney bested him in the original argument. "Stay clear of my house, and don't let me catch you near my daughter from this time on," Carson had yelled. Easygoing Barney held his temper and tried cajolery. Carson, on the contrary, became more angry and began to hurl abusive epithets beyond human endurance. "If it's the last thing I ever do, I'll make you regret those words before I leave here," declared Barney, thoroughly aroused. "No, you won't. You leave at once," shouted Carson just as his daughter entered the assay office. Later, after a stormy session between Emily and her father, the latter made a peace offering by retracting his last words. Barney rather sullenly agreed to stay, but announced that a special business would take him to Malta after supper. As the incident revived itself in Carson's thoughts, two questions disturbed him. Was Barney responsible for the shot, or was the shot intended for Barney? The latter conjecture was highly improbable. In fact, the open preference which a majority of the miners held for the young assayer was one cause of Carson's wrathful outburst. Retrospectively, Carson turned back to a time, 5 years previous, when no man had stood higher than himself in the esteem of his fellow miners. That was before the big slide, when he was merely shift boss. Afterward, puzzling changes had been instituted. Buffalo Hogan, the former superintendent, bought out Malta City's largest saloon and gambling hall. Carson succeeded him as mine superintendent, while Pap Kraus, sole survivor of the slide victims, became a childish, vacant-minded recluse, living in one of the company cabins, but secretly supported by Carson. Hypothetical reasons for this were legion, and, like nature's eternal lava pots, slumbered for indefinite intervals, only to burst with fresh upheavals of gossip whenever Carson had trouble with his crews. The general feeling found open expression through Bud Hardy, veteran mine foreman on the night shift. Bud resented and ignored Carson's orders repeatedly. The latter's patience remained in check until an accident occurred, seemingly as a result of the disobedience. Then Bud was discharged without ceremony. In leaving, the irate foreman shook his fist in Carson's face, shouting, "You fire me for this stingy little breakdown, but you forget you were made super after you'd buried a dozen good men and ducked to save your yellow hide." From that moment, matters had taken a decided turn for the worse. Hardy was popular, both in town and at the mine, and his friends began to show their resentment in countless furtive ways. Rocks falling from unthought-of places, timbers dropping without cause or warning, deadly live wires dangling in unlighted levels through which Carson sometimes passed. Lastly, a shot at his back. Suddenly Carson stiffened, his mind recalled to the present by Sutter's actions. A dozen rapid strides took him to the porch and into the office, where he found the closet door open and Sutter squatting in front of the safe. The watchman rose to his feet, meeting Carson's glare without an outward sign of uneasiness. "Is there anything about that safe particularly interesting to you, Cyanide?" demanded Carson. "Bart, yo' words is tame," drawled Sutter after a pause, "but the way you says 'em is pizen. If your conscience ain't a painin' you none, why get riled? I look to see if any mice has gnawed a hole in the safe." The corners of Carson's mouth whitened perceptibly. A strange light flickered in his eyes. Cyanide calmly closed the middle door, picked up his lantern, and started to leave. "Did you hear a shot about 30 minutes ago?" asked Carson in an offhand tone. "Shot? War?" Carson was positive. Cyanide's eyes darted to the broken window. "Can't say just where. I thought I heard one myself, that is all," he replied. Cyanide grunted and walked out. Carson tried the safe door once more, then examined the wall back of Barney's desk. His investigation led him into the laboratory, where he found the bullet lodged in the ceiling, its course indicating that it had been fired from the creek bottom. By means of a chair and a table, he was able to reach and extract the bullet, which was not so badly mutilated that its size could not be determined. His mustached lip exposed his teeth in an expression of cruel joy. The leaden missile was a .41, and Barney Donovan possessed the only gun of that caliber in Malta. He would have made an immediate search of Barney's room had not the clop-clop of galloping hoofs reached his ears. He seated himself at the desk and waited with deadly patience. Barney entered a few minutes later. His ill humor had vanished. In its stead lurked a sheepish look, the expression of a man who, though ashamed of some unmanly act, is uncertain as to the reception of his apology. Carson, misconstruing the look, eyed him narrowly. "Did you think I'd dug out altogether?" greeted Barney, dumping an armload of bundles on the desk. "It took me longer than I expected. Here's one letter for you and a note. Some fellow stopped me when I was leaving and asked me to hand it to you." Carson accepted the missives in silence. He read the note first, then, cramming it in his pocket, he opened the letter. Barney, busy at putting away his purchases, heard Carson curse in a venomous fashion. "Bad news?" he asked, good-naturedly inquisitive. Carson glowered. Barney took the hint and passed into his bedroom. "Barney, ship the bullion for me in the morning. Shipping memos all ready in the middle drawer. I'm taking the midnight train for Frisco. It seems that everybody is out to get me, so I'm going to do some getting of my own." Rasping this combined order and threat at the astonished Barney, Carson yanked the outer door open and vanished into the darkness. Chapter 2. Echoes of the morning whistle, flung back from massed ranks of pine-studded, dawn-lit hills, had hardly ceased reverberating when the mail stage honked into camp. Barney, rubbing the second nap from his eyes, scuffed into the office to greet the express guards. A crossfire of hilarious bantering ensued, after which Barney produced the shipping book and disappeared in the closet. Sutter entered in the meantime and began to converse with the messengers. Cyanide seldom came near the mine or offices when off watch, but the unusualness of his present visit was not remarked. Within the closet there were sounds of matches being struck, of objects moved hastily about. Those outside heard Barney swear. "Smatter, Barney, peeved?" called one messenger. Sutter's eyes glittered. Barney catapulted from the closet. "And who wouldn't be peeved? The safe is cleaned," he cried. Two pairs of eyes bulged in amazement. Sutter's face remained expressionless. The messengers crowded forward to view the empty safe. "Been tampered with?" queried one. "Not so's you can see it. The combination worked okay," replied Barney. "Aw, some fellow cracked it while you was pounding your ear," declared the other messenger. "Impossible. The safe's hooked up to a burglar alarm that would wake a dead man, and I cut it in just before I went to bed. Bart stayed here while I was in town, and Cyanide punches the porch clock every hour," exclaimed Barney. "Did you notice anything wrong last night, Cyanide?" he asked, turning to the watchman. "Nary a wrong. I was up here twict an hour and didn't see a soul but ya and Bart," drawled Sutter. "Maybe the thief came at it from below," suggested the first messenger. "No chance. That closet has a concrete floor 2 feet thick," explained Barney. "You can see for yourselves. There isn't a crack in it." "That's a fact, sure enough," agreed the other, adding, "Well, I guess your box is a dead one this trip, so we'll ramble. It's tough luck and no fooling. So long." After the stage disappeared in a cloud of dust, Barney spent 20 minutes in researching the safe closet and examining the exterior of the cabin. Sutter moved in and out, apparently engaged in an investigation of his own. Barney finally stepped to the telephone, first notifying the company headquarters, then passing word to the local sheriff to come out at once. "May the saints protect us when the old man gets the news," he breathed as he hung up. Barney had reference to Isaiah Middleman, president of the Malta Company, and Sutter, who had been listening, started to say something. "Hoo-hoo, Barney!" hailed a voice from without. Barney made a quick gesture for silence, hurrying outside as he did so. An animated pinto pranced from side to side in front of the steps. Seated in the saddle and swaying to the pinto's movements was one whose voice would have drawn Barney over trackless sea and desert in faithful obedience. Though no one realized it except Barney, he might have been holding a job at 1,000 more per year, but for Emily Carson's expressive hazel eyes. "Good morning, Emmy," he greeted her, permitting the pinto to nose at his pockets. "Say, Barney, I've a good scolding stored up for you. Here I've waited for breakfast a whole hour and you didn't come. Just to punish you, I'm going to make you wait till I've given Goo-Goo his morning run, heel." The pinto reared in thrilling circus fashion. "Of all the lovingest crazy animals, I'll be gone a few minutes." The last words wafted back to Barney from a confused blur of flying heels, waving tail, and billowing dust. "Where be the boss?" The brogue-tinged question brought Barney's mind back to earth. He turned to see Scanlon, the mine foreman, on the porch behind him. Sutter had gone. "Bart's gone to Frisco, Scanlon. Anything I can do for you?" "Oi were wonderin' if the boss hired anybody to take Windy Tuttle's place on the lower stope." "What's wrong with Tuttle?" "The boss fired him yesterday. Only half his crew reported this mornin', and they be drunker than a brewery cat. Oi were damned glad for to see that human air compressor go. But we be getting the best ore from the lower stope, and yez can't afford to leave it idle." When deeply perplexed, Barney always poked a pencil through his hair that was curly and blonde, though some might have dared to call it red. He manipulated his pencil for fully 2 minutes, then stepped to the telephone. An afterthought caused him to turn back without taking the receiver down. "Take a crew from some other level, Scanlon, and get along till Bart comes back. Use your own judgment. I'll stand responsible for the order." Scanlon accepted Barney's suggestion with a look of relief and hastened back to the shaft house. Barney seated himself on the porch and for a time was lost in troubled thought. Later he procured a flash lamp from his room and spent nearly half an hour re-examining the safe and the closet. The sheriff's car arrived while he was still in the closet, but he failed to hear it. More puzzled than ever, he slid back into the office on his knees and mopped the sweat from his face. "I wonder if I'm spoofy, or am I just somebody's goat? His soliloquy ended as he sighted the sheriff, who stood in the doorway. "Why, hello, Hemerson," he called to him, ashamed because he had been caught talking to himself. "Howdy, Donovan," responded the sheriff. "What appears to be the trouble?" "Well, Hemerson, it's what has disappeared that is responsible for my present trouble." Barney paused. "Hit the house pretty hard, eh? I met the stage down the line. They told me it was 100,000. Yes, the stage was waiting to take it down when I discovered the loss." "Where's Carson?" "On his way to Frisco." "Are you sure of that?" Barney rose and regarded the sheriff in surprise. "I know that he told me he was going down on the midnight train. I can ask the night operator," he replied, advancing to the phone. Hemerson voiced no objection, but showed deep interest in the one-sided conversation which followed. Barney fell to penciling his hair when he hung up. "The night operator says Windy Tuttle was the only passenger going south at midnight," he announced in a troubled voice. Hemerson stared at the broken window for a moment, then asked, "Have you any idea why Bart went to Frisco?" Barney shook his head. "Did anything happen before he left?" Barney reluctantly told of what had taken place the previous day and evening. Before he finished, the auto stage from Malta arrived. Its lone passenger, a hulking, dark-featured man, came toward the assay office. As he stepped upon the porch, Barney and Hemerson favored him with inquiring glances. "I want to see Carson," announced the stranger. "Carson is out of town. Is your business urgent?" Barney's reply was civil, though he mentally declared the man to be a compatible teammate for Cyanide Bill. "Yes, I'm Nucker, the new superintendent. I've orders from Middleman to take charge at once." Barney was surprised into silence. In the sensitive balance of his mind's scales, he weighed the stranger, at the same time sifting the news that spelled Carson's discharge. "Carson's in San Francisco. He won't be back for a day or two at least," he vouchsafed. The scales had caught their balance. Carson swung the lower beam. Nucker dangled high at the opposite end. "Any fit place to stop around here?" demanded Nucker. "You will find the boarding house open." Without seeming to notice Barney's curtness, Nucker set out in the direction indicated by Barney's pointing finger. As he swaggered up the path, the other two watched him uncompromisingly. "He ain't much on gentle looks," commented Hemerson. "Not on your flea bite," sniffed Barney contemptuously. Then he frowned. Nucker had halted and was ogling the splendid picture of horsewomanship as Emily and her pinto came charging down the mill road. With a wave and a smile for Barney, she cried as she galloped past, "Come to your breakfast, slowpoke." Nucker was not so far away as to prevent the expressions of his face from being read by Barney. Far more than admiration was registered in the coarse, brutal features. Barney watched until Emily passed from sight beyond the cabins. He saw Nucker loiter near the Carson cabin an unreasonably long time, even staring back over his shoulder when he moved on to the boarding house. "How was Bart dressed when he left you?" inquired Hemerson, anxious to reopen the interrupted subject. "Same old outfit, laced boots, moleskin trousers, brown flannel shirt, gray sombrero. You seldom find him dressed any other way." "Was this the note you brought him last night?" Barney recognized the paper which Hemerson held out. Its scrawly address would have identified it anywhere. He nodded, a question in his eyes. "Who gave it to you?" "I'm paralyzed if I can tell. I was heading out Main Street way when a fellow hollered my name. He handed me the note and told me it was for Bart. He hustled away so fast I couldn't recognize him in the darkness. Besides, I was in a tearing big hurry myself. Anything wrong?" "Read the note and see," suggested Hemerson. Barney opened the soiled sheet and read, "All set. Slip me your tip and we go to it. If you telephone, say Fool's Gold. Uno." "What do you make of it?" asked Hemerson as a pencil point began to shuttle through Barney's hair. Where did you find it?" "Where the mail stage was held up on its down trip this morning." Chapter 3. Barney backed against the wall as if thrust there by an invisible hand. "What was taken?" he managed to ask. "Nothing. 2 masked men turned the trick at the Narrows. From what the messengers told me, the pair expected the bullion box and were wilder than bobcats when they didn't find it." The telephone bell interrupted. It proved to be Middleman calling from company headquarters in San Francisco. In reply to the president's request, Barney told what Carson had said about going to the city on the midnight train. "Well, he didn't get here on it. I made it a point to meet the train," declared the irate official. Barney felt an inexplicable tightening at his throat as he passed this news to Hemerson. The sheriff listened without comment, and after inspecting the safe, as well as each means of ingress to the cabin, he hurried back to Malta. Shortly after Hemerson's departure, Emily came down from the cabins and demanded of Barney an explanation of his unprecedented tardiness. He attempted to efface his troubled look by a wan smile while he made an equivocal excuse. He would have gone to his long-overdue breakfast had there been anyone about to guard the office in his absence. "You don't happen to know what called your father away last night, do you?" he asked. "Nothing more than what he said in a note which I found on the kitchen table this morning." "What did it say?" Emily did not answer at once. Her eyes were on the broken window. "It said," she nibbled at her lip, then turned her eyes full at him, "something about important business that would keep him away several days." "Do you know how he went?" persisted Barney. "I don't really know, but he must have walked or taken the stage. His horse is in the corral, and he didn't change his clothes, so he cannot have gone far, but why catechize me so?" "Have you heard?" Barney was on the verge of announcing Knucker's arrival, but could not bring himself to utter the words. "That there's some difficulty in the mine that needs his attention," he finished lamely. Emily's eyes, now wide with just a glint of horror in them, were staring at the telltale hole above Barney's desk. He, in turn, failed to notice her expression. A faraway look filmed his eyes as he gazed toward the mill, visible through the open door. Emily stepped to the furnace room door and glanced inside. When she withdrew her head, Barney observed a baffling look in her face. All rich color had fled from her cheeks. "What's the matter, Emmy? Are you sick?" "Will you loan me your revolver, Barney?" she asked, ignoring his question. "I'm going to amuse myself at target practice while Papa is away." "Surest thing you know!" cried Barney, glad of some chance to please her. He disappeared into his room, returning a moment later with a heavy, long-barreled six-shooter and a box of cartridges. "There you are. Hope you make a bullseye every shot. I'll get more shells when these are gone." Emily accepted the weapon in silence, examining it with an air of familiarity as she moved to the door. "Well, are you coming to breakfast or not?" she asked from the doorway. "No, it's most too late now. Make it 2 and 1 at noontime," suggested Barney, advancing to her side. He reached for her free hand, but she evaded the move by stepping from the porch. Again, both were silent. "Barney, I'm disappointed in you." She suddenly flung over her shoulder, then sped away up the path. Barney's hand automatically fished a pencil from his pocket while he tried to fit her parting declaration to something he had or had not done. When he could no longer see her, he turned back to his desk. At noontime, he found her in a more friendly mood, though her enigmatic questions gave him food for uneasy thought throughout the afternoon. The mid-afternoon stage brought the company's special detectives, Harper and Sims. Barney welcomed them in the mood he imagined he would have felt in the presence of his own executioners. The detectives lost no time in getting to their task. Barney answered their ceaseless questions as best he could, giving them full benefit of his meager knowledge concerning the robbery itself. After an exhaustive search of the interior of the cabin, the trio proceeded outside. Nothing escaped Harper's eyes, and Barney gave him the information he requested by pointing out different trails and buildings in sight. Directly west of the office, they came to the brink of an arroyo. Between rainy seasons, this arroyo was dry, except for a pool of slime-covered water, cut off from Little Snake Creek by a wide gravel bar. The west bank was considerably lower than the spot where the men were standing. Beyond the arroyo, a cabin roof was visible amid dumps of chaparral and scrub oak. "And who might live there?" asked Harper, pointing. "Old Pap Kraus," answered Barney. "What's his business?" "Just existing. He's been a keen old chap in his day, but only half-baked now. He was in the big slide a few years back. They say it was the company's fault, and to square themselves they deeded him some dead land with a cabin on it, then let it ride at that." "Is he dangerous?" "Not at all. Harmless as a babe. Carson's daughter helps him, and he thinks the world of her, but he doesn't seem to shine up to her dad much. He's pretty rational as a rule. Sometimes his mind flops over, and he isn't heard from for days at a stretch." Harper, releasing his breath in a long, noisy exhalation, surveyed the scene in silence. The evening whistle boomed its signal, and the three turned back to the office. Sutter came down the path as they entered, leaving him to watch the office. Barney accompanied the detectives to the boarding house. After introducing them to the boarding boss as mine inspectors, he set out for Carson's cabin. On the way, he sighted Nucker in close conversation with Scanlon and the night mine foreman. Both day and night mill foremen were in the group also. At the supper table, Emily's quietness and reserve caused Barney to wonder if she had heard of the robbery yet. He lingered a long time after the supper dishes were cleared away. Then, gathering his courage, he told her of the morning discovery, all but the note. Emily pondered a moment before replying, her eyes downcast, the color rising and ebbing in her cheeks. The news had not leaked out as yet and came as a shock to her. "Barney, are you going to be ungrateful enough to hint that Papa took that gold, especially after you've tried to injure him, or was murder your intention?" Emily's tone was throaty, vibrant with hurt surprise. Barney sat up in his chair with a start. "Was murder my intention?" he echoed. "Say, Emmy, I'll admit that queer bugs ramble through my intelligence plant occasionally. But do you really call it attempted murder on my part when I simply obey a law of nature and refuse to let your dad choke me as he tried? I admit that you were justified in protecting yourself then. But there was no excuse for your sneaking behind his back and shooting at him like a coward." "Shoot at him? What's the answer, Emmy? I haven't shot at anything for so long I've forgotten what powder smells like. What makes you?" Emily's gesture was imperious as she spread a note before Barney's eyes. "Emily, I'll be gone a few days on important business. Keep a sharp eye on young Donovan. He tried to get even by shooting me in the back. You can see the bullet hole over his desk. I'll attend to him when I get back. Dad." Barney skimmed over the note, reread it more slowly, then looked up, smiling queerly. "Hadn't we better let it ride until he does return?" he asked. "You don't deny it, then?" Emily's lips tightened, her eyes flashed. "Why should I even attempt to deny such a far-fetched accusation as that?" For answer, Emily leaped to her feet and stepped to a shelf near the door. When she returned to the table, she laid Barney's six-shooter in front of him, also an empty cartridge. "I'm the bummest guesser in the world, Emmy," smiled Barney. "What's the answer?" "The answer? Oh, I might have known you'd say that. A man who shoots like a coward is bound to be too cowardly to own up to his tricks," declared Emily passionately. "The answer is, you stood in the creek last night when Papa was good enough to sit up while you went to town. And when you got a good chance at his back, you tried to kill him. The mark of your bullet is over your desk and in the ceiling of the furnace room. You left the empty shell where you stood. Then it seems you were cunning enough to reload and have a box of cartridges handy with only 6 shells missing. And to think I've trusted you all these months and treated you as my own brother and—" Tears began to rise, unbidden, to the surface with the last words. She paused to check them. Barney traced an aimless trail through his hair and inspected the empty cartridge to discover that it was a duplicate of those in the weapon. He rolled it back and forth on the table with 2 fingers, deliberating upon an answer. His decision ready, he prepared to leave. "I've an idea, Emmy, that if we let this subject rest till we've had a night's sleep, we can come to a rational understanding. Keep the evidence you have. Explanations won't help me just now. Anyway, I'll see you at breakfast time." Emily caught her breath to protest as the door closed behind him. Then she gave way to woman's greatest panacea for soul burdens, tears. The night watchman was in earnest conversation with Harper and Sims when Barney entered the assay office, but hurried out at once as if desirous of avoiding him. He would have gone directly to his room had not the detectives detained him with more questions. As soon as he dared, he excused himself, saying, "I'm dead tired, fellows. I'll roll in now and see you all in the morning." Scarcely had he latched the bedroom door than sounds of an auto approaching at high speed reached him. Brakes screeched under the strain of a sudden stop. Someone struck the porch in a jump. bursting unceremoniously into the office. "Where's Donovan?" demanded a deep bass voice. "Hello, Hemerson. What'll you have?" greeted Barney, reopening his door. "Just a word with you, in private." Barney, startled, uneasy, beckoned the sheriff into the bedroom. The instant the door closed, Hemerson produced a massive, bone-handled six-shooter. "Ever see this gun before?" Barney gulped and nodded. "It's Bart's," he admitted in a half-whisper. "You are sure of that?" Again Barney nodded, his lips shaping themselves to say, "Why?" "Bud Hardy has been murdered, shot in the back. I picked this gun up 10 paces from his body." Chapter 4. The sheriff's words were distinct enough, but Barney had to mouth them, parrot fashion, in his bewilderment. His hand strayed to the pencil holder. "I was headed home for the night when I heard the shot," explained Hemerson. "Hardy was at Hogan's joint all evening, sopping up the ugly juice and shouting about how wild Carson was because he, Hardy, had busted the super's job. They say Hardy staggered out the back way, declaring he'd show Bart up still more before he was done. The gun barked 2 minutes later. When I got to the alley where it happened, Hardy was dead. I stepped on this gun before I reached him. See for yourself, one shell is empty. The gun was hot when I picked it up." "Maybe somebody else borrowed or stole the gun," interposed Barney. "Such a thing could happen, but how about this? It was clutched in Hartley's right hand." Hemerson held out a horsehair chain, a nugget charm, and Carson's watch attached to it. The watch crystal was gone, the hands twisted. "God, Hemerson," groaned Barney. "Isn't there some chance of proving that a mistake has been made? This will be, what will become of Emmy?" Hemerson, preoccupied by his own deductions, pulled at his earlobe without replying. At length he pocketed the gun and watch, then left the bedroom. Halting at the outer door, he called back, "I came near forgetting. Found one of your men down the road a ways too drunk to walk. I gave him a lift. He's out in my machine. Hello, here he is on the porch." Barney gazed past Hemerson and saw Windy Tuttle swaying drunkenly in the light of the open door. "One of the devil's own, you mean?" snorted Barney, adding, "This man is responsible for 9/8 of our trouble at the mine. He's a dirty bootlegger. I'm betting he's loaded with booze right now, outside and inside both." Hemerson seized the inebriate by the collar and yanked him into the office, searching his pockets thoroughly. A pocket knife, some small change, a 6-shooter, and a quart bottle containing a small quantity of whiskey constituted Windy's possessions. The sheriff evinced keen interest in the gun, and Windy, released from the none too gentle grip, slumped grotesquely to the floor. Barney's face bore a nauseated look as he watched the act. "Now if this shooting iron was a .45, things might perk up for Bart," vouchsafed Hemerson. "Although one of these chambers is empty. Hardy was killed with a .41. Besides," he sniffed at the muzzle, "this blunderbuss ain't been fired any time soon, from the smell." The mention of the weapon's caliber excited Barney's instant attention. It was an exact counterpart of the gun he had loaned Emily that morning. He said nothing, however, but scrutinized Windy with smoldering eyes. "Well, Donovan, do what you like with Tuttle's exhibits. I've got to be moving back." "I'll see you later," announced Hemerson, leaping into his car. After the sheriff's departure, Harper, Sims, and Barney regarded the besotted miner with varied expressions of disgust. Barney returned the knife and changed to Windy's pockets the bottle of brain disturber he smashed against the porch steps, the gun he carefully hid in his own room. Lastly, he took firm hold on Windy's shoulders, dragging him out into the open like a log of wood. He was sorely tempted to shove his whiskey-soaked burden over into the slime-covered pool. Instead, he left him lying in a patch of wire grass. Back in his bedroom, he turned out the light and flung himself on the bed to marshal his thoughts into some semblance of order. A mumbling conversation between Harper and Sims continued an hour, much to his annoyance. Then they left. Some time afterward, maudlin voices passed the assay office outward bound. One hiccuping remark reminded Barney of Tuttle, and he breathed a profane wish concerning Windy's eternal future. At dawn he leaped to his feet, surprised to find that he had fallen asleep without disrobing. No one came near the assay office until long after the whistle blew. In consequence, he was again late for breakfast. When he reached the Carson cabin, he found Emily watering her pinto and her father's pony. Pity wrung his heart as he noted her red and swollen eyelids. "And how's every little thing this morning?" he asked cheerfully. Emily shook her head, not daring to speak. Unabated tears lurked too close to the surface. Attributing her silence to her suspicions, he tried to frame a question that lay closest to his heart. Before he could utter a word, he saw her eyes widen and stare at some object behind him. Turning, he discovered Knucker's swarthy face leering at her from the opposite side of the corral. Instinctive rage banished all other worries from Barney's mind. He would have enjoyed heaving a rock at the grinning stranger. "Who is he?" whispered Emily. "That," contemptuously, "is supposed to be your father's better, calls himself Knucker, the new superintendent." Without an eyelash quivering, Emily gazed full into the newcomer's face. Knucker bowed and mumbled, "Good morning," but her eyes never wavered. Notwithstanding a natural twinge of jealousy, Barney watched with interest. No impertinent masher had yet been seen around Malta who could withstand Emily's scathing stare. Once convinced that she was picked as a masher's victim, her hazel eyes became batteries of withering fire. But unlike the uncultured roughness of minors or the flippantly rude advances of occasional strangers, Knucker stood in a class distinctly separate from all others. In his brutish domain, sacred rite was tabooed, purity was dross. Barney saw Emily's cheeks flame, not the delicate mantling of a blush, but a deep, dull red signal of anger. He dared not trust himself to look at Knucker. Gently taking the pail from her hand, he urged in a low voice, "Come into the kitchen, I've something to tell you." She yielded to the pressure of Barney's hand at her elbow and turned toward the cabin, her pinto nickering his hurt surprise at not receiving a farewell pat. Knucker watched the two enter the kitchen, then, with an evil chuckle, he set out for the mill office. While Emily prepared breakfast in silence, Barney withdrew to a corner and lifted a snow-white cat from his favorite chair, giving the deposed tabby the benefit of his lap. For a time, he stroked the cat without speaking. Too blunt to be tactful, too truthful to be secretive, he debated long before taking up the disagreeable subject. He began by telling her the so far unofficial information that her father was superseded by Knucker. He fought shy of mentioning the holdup or the murder, yet he realized that if he did not inform her of those calamities, there were neighbors who thrived on such morbid gossip. Furtively, he watched her move from stove to table and back, then, with a deep sigh, gripped his courage for the plunge. "Emmy, about how much bad news can you stand all at once?" A stove lid dropped, clattering, ringing to the floor. White-faced, lifter in hand, she whirled to face him. He could not meet her eyes. Slowly stroking the cat, he continued, "What would you do if they should find indisputable evidence against your father, both for murder and robbery?" "Oh, don't sit like a block of wood and keep me in suspense," she managed to scold hysterically. Barney groped for suitable words. "Barney Donovan, don't you dare put me off another minute." Emily stamped her foot and nearly tore her apron as she twisted its corners in her agitation. Then Barney told her of the note, the stage holdup, the murder of Hardy, the damning evidence which Hemerson had secured, and which pointed to Carson as the guilty man. Emily seemed to shrivel under the blow. The kitchen clock's ticking sounded loud above the muffled roar of stamps. Tabby purred as if no sorrow were near, digging her foreclaws into Barney's thigh to express her enjoyment. The wood fire snapped and cracked in the semi-stillness. With one forefinger pressed against her teeth, a gesture of hers which always preluded an outburst of anguish, Emily sank into a chair. Suddenly she cast herself forward upon the table and burst into a storm of violent sobbing. A tremble in sympathy, Barney brushed the cat from his lap and stepped to her side. "Oh, I begged Papa to leave this hateful old mine when Mama died," sobbed Emily. "I've lived in such dread lately, and my dreams have been terrible. Papa owes somebody a lot of money. He's always hard-pressed for enough to meet his payments. The last few days he's been so glum I couldn't sleep for worrying about him. And that Bud Hardy has been just as spiteful as he could be. If that letter you brought Papa was a notice of dismissal, there's no telling. He might have felt so desperate as to take the gold in revenge. But I'm sure he wouldn't kill anybody. Unless maybe Bud Hardy attacked him and he had to shoot to save himself. Oh, it's just awful." Another storm of grief checked her words. Barney patted her shoulders. "I sure hated to say a word, Emmy, but you'd have found it out from the neighbors after a while, and I thought it best you should know right away." Her sobs grew in volume. "If you'll just come down with me to the minister's, I'll be able to step in and take care of you. Nobody will dare abuse my wife." Emily straightened as suddenly as she had collapsed. Barney Donovan dashing the tears from her eyes. "If you are willing to help me, do so like a man, but don't be thinking I'm so helpless I've got to marry to protect myself." Barney stared, hurt, dumbfounded. "Why, I wouldn't marry the best man alive while this disgrace is upon Papa and me," she declared proudly. "If you are the friend you profess to be, get out and show it. Prove Papa absolutely innocent before you dare talk marriage to me." As an added fling, she continued, "And you haven't proved to me yet that you did not try to shoot Papa in the back yourself." Barney offered no reply. He was dazed. Unconsciously, he turned upon his heel and walked out without a word of parting. He was not angry. His was that deep-rooted soul hurt which comes to those whose honest intentions are spurned or misinterpreted. At the assay office, he again met Nucker, who inquired for Carson. Barney's reply was a cool negative. Nucker departed, and the two detectives put in an appearance. From them, Barney learned that not a footprint, fingerprint, or wheel track had been discovered that would indicate how or where the bullion had been taken. But much was being gathered from statements of the miners that added a sinister light to the already overwhelming evidence against Carson. Also, Middleman had received a mysterious telephone call from someone who offered to reveal the stolen cash if granted $20,000 and immunity from arrest. Middleman made a vain attempt to keep his caller in conversation until he was located. Subsequent inquiries showed that the stranger had called from one of the Bay Shore cities, and that he was tall and dressed like a miner or a rancher. Barney shut himself in the furnace room to think. He fought hard to repel the suspicion that knocked insistently for admission. Could it be that Carson was really playing a deep, crafty game by which he meant to profit both in money and liberty? At the end of an hour, he threw down the crucible he was cleaning and went into the office. "If the law can't prove Bart's innocence, Barney Donovan will," he muttered. Then he telephoned to the Shaft House and asked that Scanlon be sent to him. Chapter 5. "What's your opinion of Bart Carson, Scanlon?" Barney asked when the two were closeted in Barney's room. "There wasn't a finer man in the outfit than him when he were shift boss." Barney indulged in a slight smile at the evasion. What queered him with the men? Did they get sore just because he was promoted? "There's been many a rumor, lad. But one of the reasons for Mike Scanlon not having a scab on his nose is his delicate regard for things that be none of his business." Barney smiled broadly this time, a confident smile born of his judgment of the cautious foreman. Scanlon liked Barney above all other men at the mine, and Barney knew it. For that reason, he learned much concerning the mine's mysterious past history before another hour elapsed. "And I'm tellin' ye, lad, 'tis Buffalo Hogan Yez must buzz about the slide. Buffalo's got a thumb hold on mighty near every old-timer around Malta, except Mike Scanlon. And Buffalo be knowin' that Oi kape me mouth shut for the good av me soul. And Mike, breathed Barney, for the good of Emily's soul and her dad's as well as mine, I'll keep my own mouth closed and my eyes and ears wide open. Oi believe ye, lad, and Oi'll tell yez somethin' more. That knucker man has worked here afore now, or Oi've never said the truth in all me life. Yez asked me for the names av them that was killed. If the timekeeper has the old records, Oi can pick 'em out. There was one chap, a mucker I'm rememberin', they never did find. All right, Scanlon, we'll make for the timekeeper the minute the watchman shows up here again. And if you have nothing important on the slate for tonight, I wish you'd stick around in my place until I get back. Scanlon gave willing assent, and at the watchman's appearance both started for the mine office. The timekeeper was doubtful as to having the information as old as Barney wanted, but he obligingly made a search of an obscure filing case. Fortunately, the payroll records for the past 6 years were still intact, and Scanlon was soon running a calloused, blue-nailed forefinger down a column of names. There were 14, counting Bart, in that level the day she slid, he explained, as he checked off the names his memory recalled. Part of the crew were stopping overhand from the face of the drift when the timbering began to settle. Bart. He rushed the gang in with all the extra timbers handy, then headed for the main shaft on the run to order more. He hadn't run 10 yards before the whole 13 were buried without a bit of warning, and they do be tellin' since that Buffalo had warned Bart to keep away from that level altogether. Anyway, old Pap was the only one alive of the dozen we found. They never did find this chap's body. Scanlon thumped his work-hardened finger on the name Jim Kerr with increased emphasis in each tap as he shot a meaningful look at Barney. Satisfied with his encouraging start, Barney hurried back to the assay office. Throughout the forenoon, his brain was a mine of plans in itself. When he went to dinner, Emily was so moody and quiet that the meal would have been a dismal affair but for his busy thoughts. Even his announcement that he would not be in for supper did not draw more than a listless "very well" from her lips. The evening whistle brought Scanlon promptly to the assay office, and Barney, his pony saddled and waiting, lost no time in getting away. In town, he went direct to the depot. Very little of the night operator's information was helpful, however, and after stabling his pony, Barney strolled to other places he had in mind. At long intervals, he sauntered in and out of Hogan's saloon, hoping to catch a glimpse of its famous proprietor. In this he failed. Buffalo was presiding over the nightly games no longer permitted to run openly. That was a phase of mining life recreation that Barney was little versed in, nor did he care to be. Therefore he made no attempt to visit the gaming rooms. On one of his calls at the saloon, he came upon an oddly assorted trio lined up at the bar: Windy Tuttle, Pap Kraus, and a stranger. Scenting valuable information, Barney stepped aside to watch their actions. Windy and the stranger were plying the old man with liquor, which he appeared reluctant to accept. The harder the two persisted, the more stubborn he became. Tuttle lost patience finally and began to curse and shake the old fellow. Indignant, Barney stepped forward to take the weakling's part. In a casual glance into the back bar mirror, Windy caught sight of Barney's frowning eyes. He paused, open-mouthed, clinging tipsily to the bar, a sodden grin creeping into his bony face. Then, with a lurch, he seized Kraus by the arm and piloted him to the street, the stranger at his heels. Barney's first impulse was to follow. On second thought, he gave vent to a languid yawn and sidled down the bar to where the most voluble of 3 bartenders held forth. "I didn't know old Pap Kraus indulged in fermented joy," he remarked after ordering a fizz. A mixed drink would give excuse for a casual question or two, he reasoned. "It's the second time he's kicked up our sawdust in years," vouchsafed the aproned one, deftly breaking an egg into the mixer. "Humph! What does he do?" buy a carload at a time, or is he something of a camel in his thirst requirements? How long since his other visit to this jag market? He took on a few this morning, might have been yesterday, I ain't sure. Those 2 greasy coats fetched him in. I got a bunch they're trying to skin the old guy out of something. What could that nutty old musher have that's worth skinning him out of? Queried Barney with assumed contempt. Damfino. You can't always get their number. I've been hep to a lot of nuts you'd swear was batty, but all the time there's a pay streak in their noodle that's got the wise ginks peeled raw. Barney did not put another question. Instead, he took off his hat to give the pencil a chance. Downing his drink in hasty gulps when the bartender drew back the seltzer siphon, he tossed the change on the bar and left. Out on the street, he lost no time in visiting the local marshal, to whom he put numerous questions relative to the habits and movements of old Kraus. He learned that the old fellow had tramped into town early the previous morning, decked out for one of his periodic trips. The old man encountered Windy and the stranger in front of Hogan's place. After a lengthy argument, Kraus broke from them and tottered down the street, waving his arms and shouting incoherently. From the marshal's office, Barney went to Hogan's for a last look, then, calling for his pony, he headed for the mine. West of the mine, he guided the pony into a side trail and approached the Kraus cabin. Everything was dark and silent. Nevertheless, he dismounted and knocked, the door swinging open under his touch. Inside, he noticed a warmth which came from neither the evening temperature nor the retained heat of the day. By striking matches, he located a lantern which he lit and began to search the room. A crude bed filled with straw but devoid of bedding occupied one corner. Running his hand through the straw, he discovered what he least expected to find: a pair of high-topped lace boots. His face was grave as he crossed the room to a cupboard. In passing the cook stove, he noticed heat and found live coals beneath the ashes. At the cupboard, he rummaged through a jumble of cooking utensils and canned goods. A mouse scurried out of a broken package of cereal and into some papers on an upper shelf. These he jerked down, uncovering a gray sombrero. A hissing exclamation escaped him when he examined the hat. Punched in the sweatband were the letters BC. Utterly discouraged, he turned to where a number of soiled garments hung from pegs beside the rear door. He looked them over and selected from among them a pair of moleskin trousers, also a brown flannel shirt, torn and blood-stained. In one of the pockets, he found a crumpled envelope directed to Carson and bearing the company's return address, the same envelope he had delivered to Carson the eve of the robbery. After a prolonged deliberation, he gathered the incriminating garments together and carried them out to his pony. Returning, he examined the ground and paths around the cabin. In the rear, all footprints were overrun by tracks of rodents. In front, he could see where the last man before him had gone toward the creek, but his own approach had obliterated all chance of identifying them. He cursed his thoughtlessness. Then, fastening Carson's clothes to the saddle, he replaced the lantern where he had found it. With his foot in the stirrup, preparatory to mounting, he noticed the pony jerk up its head, ears pointed creekward. A twig snapped close at hand. He muzzled the pony with his hand and listened to a rustling sound that drew near. A moment later, a shadow glided past at some distance from him. It was a human figure, yet it did not move like a man. A board creaked as the shadow stepped upon the cabin's excuse for a porch, then a light tapping on the door. After a second and louder series of taps, the shadow pushed the door open, and a tremulous voice called, "Are you there, Papa?" A multitude of sensations swept over Barney. His expression of surprise was almost profane, nearly outspoken. Emily Carson down there at that hour, and calling for her father. Barney's temptation was to rush into the cabin and confront her. He evaded the impulse by mounting and galloping full speed toward the mine. Scanlon was dozing by catnaps when Barney entered the assay office. The foreman blinked owlishly at him, then at the clock, which indicated 10 minutes of 2. "I'm sure thankful for your accommodation, Scanlon. I'll see you tomorrow. I need more advice. I'm all in now. Here's a couple of good smokes." Barney held out 2 cigars, nervously expecting to be questioned, but whatever curiosity Scanlon felt was not manifest in his yawning, albeit grateful. "'Tis a princey be, lad," as he passed out into the night. Chapter 6. An imperative rapping brought Barney to his feet in a single jump. He looked at his watch to find that he had overslept a full half-hour. The rapping increased, accompanied by a rattling of the doorknob. He made sure Carson's clothes were not in evidence, then admitted the caller. Nucker confronted him, demanding the combination of the safe. More angered than amazed by the arrogant request, Barney refused. "What?" rasped Nucker, his lower jaw outthrust. "You'd better understand that from now on I'm boss around this mine by middleman's orders. I don't care if you are hell's own ruler. You won't get any safe combination from me until I hear middleman's voice myself," retorted Barney. Then he slammed the door and began to dress. Nucker strode wrathfully from the office. 15 minutes later he was back, accompanied by Harper. By this time Barney was up and out. "Morning, Donovan," greeted Harper. "Middleman sent to tell you yesterday to take Carson's place and gave him instructions to take full charge at once." "I'm not stopping him, am I?" growled Barney, irritation getting the best of his temper. Harper shrugged his shoulders noncommittally. "You refuse to obey my order," snarled Nucker. "If it's the safe combination that's responsible for your sourball, just believe I'm still refusing until Middleman gives his order direct to me." Having delivered himself of this ultimatum, Barney went out on his way to breakfast. 2 sleep-stinted nights in succession, plus a seemingly endless chain of depressing discoveries. This overshadowed by Emily's irrefutable association with her father's hiding place, reduced Barney to mute glumness at the breakfast table. His mumbled good morning without the usual Emmy, his evasive attitude throughout the meal, and his wordless departure left his hostess in another paroxysm of grief, in which sore-felt neglect was not unmixed with vexation. En route to the assay office, Barney caught an inspiration that sent him post-haste in search of Scanlon. He found the foreman on one of the lower levels. "Say, Scanlon, you're pretty familiar with Buffalo Hogan's habits, aren't you?" he asked when the two were out of eye and earshot of the crews. "I'm having a fair-sized knowledge of his tricks." "I knew it. Now everybody knows he's a roughneck pug that no one in these parts has been able to lick, and he has a reputation for high speed on a gun draw. Besides, as you say, he's got a thumb hold on the old-timers, but just the same, Scanlon, hasn't he got a queer streak of some kind that's worth a saying?" Scanlon's grizzled head wagged slowly from right to left in a wary survey of the adit. "By golly, lad, where did yez get the ID? They do say Buffalo's a crank on hoodoo numbers, and he niver touches a card the day after he has a certain kind av a nightmare. Do yez ever take a hand at his tables?" "No, Scanlon, and what's more, I don't intend to if I can avoid it. All I want. Listen, lad, if yez are in no great hurry, Oi'll try for to find out if he's as bogified as he used to be. Oi can let yez know in the mornin'." "Take your time," Barney said buoyantly. "Helpful information is of more value than haste. I'll see you later." Barney pivoted on his heel and headed for the shaft. "Just another bit avy warnin', Barney," added Scanlon, taking the same direction. "Be a bit careful of how yez spake to the new boss. Ye'd better humor him for a time, because, well, yez know what was said about holdin' your fire till yez see the white of the eye." Barney smiled his self-confidence and rang for the cage. Nevertheless, when he reached the surface and walked toward the assay office, he pondered long and soberly on the old foreman's words. Before he reached the office, he caught sight of Nucker ransacking the desk. Not caring to meet that domineering official just then, he turned down into the creek bottoms. In the vicinity of the Kraus cabin, he overheard Windy Tuttle's drawling voice, also the quavering treble of an older man pleading for mercy. He quickened his pace in time to hear, "Ding bust your hidebound carcass, you took it, you know you did. Now tell me whar it's hid, or by Jackie I'll crack your worm-eaten bean." "No, no, no," moaned the voice. "Don't hurt poor old Pap. He never takes nothin'. Everybody feels sorry for poor old Pap. Don't, oh don't." The senile pleading ended in a gurgle. Barney mounted the bank in one leap. 10 paces away, Windy stood over the kneeling figure of old Kraus, choking and shaking him unmercifully. "Hey, you cur, none of that." The next instant, Windy went sprawling, stumbling into the underbrush, flung there by a savage sweep of Barney's right arm. Windy gaped up and over his shoulder in rum-dum amazement, then went threshing from sight through the undergrowth. Barney assisted Kraus to his cabin. The enfeebled old man had been roughly handled, so much so that it was several minutes before he could give any rational explanation of what had taken place. But during the brief period of sanity that did ensue, Barney was given a mental view of inner mysteries, which sent him back to the assay office, with knitted brows and clenched teeth. At the hour Barney was conferring with Scanlon in the mine, Emily received a visit. Just as she completed her morning's work, a knock at the front door surprised her. Hope and fear assailed her heart simultaneously as she hastened to answer. To her dismay, the caller was neither father nor lover. "Ah, good morning, Miss Carson. I'm looking for a private place to board. I'm the new boss, you know." "Knucker's my name," announced that individual with the dynamic gentleness one might detect in the bellow of a savage bull. Emily had thrown the door wide open. A glimpse of her caller caused her to close it to a less inviting angle. His announcement reduced the opening to a 2-inch crack. "We do not keep boarders," she said haughtily. "Oh, I won't be much bother." "You don't?" The unappreciative surface of a tightly locked door flung Knucker's words back into his face. A caustic oath tainted the air as he turned to leave, and the vow he registered would have caused Emily more uneasiness had she heard it. As a result of her flare at Barney, Emily had put in a miserable day and night. The news of Carson's untraceable disappearance, the mystifying bullion robbery, the stage holdup, and the murder of Bud Hardy had spread and grown like a pestilence. The settlement babblers gathered around her in croaking flocks, profuse with platitudes and prophecies, but barren of sympathy and comfort. In addition to this, she was both provoked at herself for her unstrung resentment of Barney's well-meant proposal and half angry at him because of his apparent intention to ignore her for it. Noon passed, yet he did not come for his dinner. By 1 o'clock, she could stand the suspense no longer, and swallowing her pique and pride, she hurried to the assay office. Knucker was alone at Barney's desk when she arrived. His eyes glittered treacherously when he saw her coming. "Is Mr. Donovan in?" Without entering, she stammered her inquiry from the doorway. "Not now, miss, but I'll sure be pleased to serve in his place. Is there anything I can do for you?" "No, I must see him. When will he return?" "I can't say. He's probably gone to the city." Emily's face fell in spite of her bravery. "Have you heard from your father yet?" If vinegar possessed sweetness, Knucker's voice was saccharine. "When Mr. Donovan returns, please tell him Miss Carson would like to see him about a very important matter," requested Emily evasively as she turned to go. "Just one moment, Miss Carson." Knucker rose ponderously from the desk chair. Emily paused, an uncontrollable shiver running over her. "It's no use of my mincing words, miss. I know all about your father's trouble, and it happens I'm in the right position to help him out of his scrape. I've helped lots of people when they've been down and out. You see, I'm not such a bad fellow when you get to know my ways. The words were not without effect, although she did not reply. "I haven't been received into this camp very cheerfully," continued Knucker. Emily was tracing imaginary lines on the porch post, and there was a vulturous gleam in his eyes as he watched her. "But I ain't taking offense. My turn will come. They always shut the door in my face at first. After that, they come back and lick my hand, but that's what a fellow gets for not looking like a spoon-fed parlor entertainer. Now I'm going to show you how square I really am. I'm going to get your father clear of his jam before the week is out, and all I'm going to ask in return is that you treat me like a human being." Half convinced that she jumped to a hasty conclusion in her previous judgment of Knucker, Emily felt a twinge of remorse. After all, Barney might be mistaken. It was not uncommon for lovers to be jealous of strangers. She flashed him a warm smile over her shoulder. "If you will do that great kindness for my father, you may be sure that I shall make all amends I possibly can for shutting the door in your face," she declared gently. "And just as soon as Papa returns, you will be welcome to call on us at any time." With her last words, she stepped down and sped up the path toward the cabins. At the same moment, Barney, his face chalk-white jaw muscles ridged out like whipcords, came around the corner of the office and mounted the porch. Emily had not seen him, and he had arrived only in time to hear the last clause of her conversation. Knucker stood just inside the doorway, his vicious eyes intent upon his departing visitor. Barney entered, glaring straight at the beast-like face. Neither man spoke. Knucker wheeled insolently and crossed to the desk, while by strenuous effort, Barney curbed an inclination to leap upon the big man's shoulders. Barney was nearer to actual murder than he had ever been. The very care he exercised in closing his bedroom door bespoke his deadly anger. As to Knucker's secret mind, a change of assayers would occur as soon as a new one could be engaged. Chapter 7. Barney locked himself in and spent considerable time brooding and reviling. He shook off the mood at length, and arming himself with pad and pencil, tilted his chair against the wall and was soon lost in the maze of the mystery of the problem. Although Pap Krause had given him a momentary glance at a mystery within a mystery, such statements must, of necessity, be taken with salt, owing to the old man's unsoundness of mind. Windy and the stranger were elements in the case both suspicious and erratic. Windy's deep interest in the old man, and the accusation which suggested hidden wealth, would bear further investigation. The .41 gun taken from Windy gave him food for thought. It was identical with the one he had loaned Emily. In fact, both guns were a pair which he had brought to Malta himself, and the one discovered on Tuttle was, or should have been, in Barney's saddle holster the night before the bullion robbery. Knucker was a factor of real menace, not only to the welfare of the mine but to Barney's peace and happiness, and required close watching, if only for the latter reason. Hogan was the sphinx of them all. Any time Scanlon made a statement, it could be counted upon as a fact. Barney was convinced that the notorious gambler's heart was a storehouse of keys that would unlock every solution. But to shatter that stronghold without destroying precious evidence, the pencil disregarded the paper in preference for the amateur detective's hair. The evening whistle found him still unable to locate a path that would lead him out of the labyrinth. It was long past supper time when he finally laid his problem aside and went to brave the late-again rebuke that would greet his entrance into the Carson kitchen. In his present mood he would have gone on to the boarding house, but on passing the Carsons' cabin, he saw Emily at the wood pile filling her apron with wood. He hastened to relieve her of the task. "Why, hello, stranger," she greeted, mischievousness bubbling to the surface in spite of her grief. "Good evening, Emmy," he answered, sober-faced. "You know that I'm not a stranger in thought," he added. She started to reply, and checked her words by biting her lip. then stood gazing toward the corral where her pinto was nibbling at the fence. She was between Barney and the last thin crescent of the setting sun as it dropped behind a ragged skyline, and it was well for his self-control that his arms were filled with wood. A tightness gripped his throat as he carried his load into the kitchen. Emily followed, but he deposited the wood in the box and started for another armful, hardly daring to look at her. "I say, Mr. Donovan, have you forgotten how to talk?" she inquired mockingly. He realized that he was thinking of nothing worthy to say. He was not angry, he was no longer a child, he was just human, and the grit in the oil of his hope was her invitation to knucker. He stole a sidelong glance over his shoulder. She stood at the table, her premonitory forefinger pressed against her teeth. The signal was unmistakable to him, and he paused on the threshold. "I've got a lot to tell you as soon as I fill this wood box," he answered. While they lingered over their supper, he recounted many of his recent experiences, wisely omitting any mention of Carson or of his midnight visit to the Kraus cabin. After supper, the conversation lagged, yet Barney was loath to leave. Emily got out her sewing, and as she worked, she kept the conversation from dying out altogether by asking occasional questions. All subjects exhausted, Barney braced himself to speak of knucker. "I see you called on the new boss today. How did you know?" queried Emily absently as she bit off a thread, her mind upon other matters. A white-hot flash swept over Barney. "I reached the assay office just as you left," he answered in a low, tense tone after a lengthy pause. Emily dropped her sewing into her lap, her eyes focused upon a framed picture, her thoughts centered upon her father, whose face it outlined. "What do you see about this knucker?" A timid knock upon the back door interrupted Barney's question. Emily whirled as if it had been a pistol shot. One hand flew to her bosom. The sewing slid, unhindered, to the floor. Barney glanced at her inquiringly, then stepped to the door himself. On the steps, in the patch of lamplight, stood old Pap Kraus. "Got to see Emily, quick!" panted the old man in a mysterious whisper. "All right, Pap, come in, rest yourself," invited Barney. The old man shook his head emphatically and handed out a slip of paper. "No, no, no, old Pap must hurry home," he whined, and slunk away in the thickening shadows. Barney passed the note to Emily, then turned to reseat himself. A low, pained cry from her caused him to look around. With tears in her eyes, she handed him the note. "Emily will follow this note in half-hour. Keep mum on my coming, I might be mobbed. I need clothes and money, have them ready. I won't stay long, not safe. Say nothing, but do not worry. Dab." Emily plied him with innumerable and unanswerable questions, but with his own mind upset by the situation, he remained silent. She replenished the fire to prepare something to eat, then stole into her father's bedroom, from which she emerged with his business suit. Next, she procured her purse from her own room. Barney gulped as he watched her dump out a pitifully small amount of silver coin. His hand went plunging deep into his own pocket, with the result that several gold pieces, all he had with him, joined the heap of lesser coin. The tremulous, misty smile which he received repaid him with usury. The wait seemed interminable. Emily became restless, pinning the curtains down as a double precaution. At length the rear door opened stealthily, and in slipped an apparition in greasy overalls and jumper. Emily flew to him with a pitying cry. Barney placed a chair and seized him by the hand. Carson sank into the seat heavily, sighing his exhaustion. "Whatever has gone wrong, Papa?" begged Emily, kissing his sunken cheeks and fingering a blood-stained bandage that encircled his head. "What has happened to you? How are you ever to clear yourself?" "Don't pester me with questions now, Emily. I'm in no humor to answer them. Give me the clothes and the money. Buffalo Hogan and his roughnecks have started a double-cross game I'm going to finish to their sorrow. Middleman sitting in, too, "And by the eternal, he's going to pay high on the showdown," growled Carson bitterly. "Oh, Papa, for my sake, for your own sake, please, please don't get mixed up worse than you are now," pleaded Emily, the tears beginning to flow. "Don't worry, if they keep out of my way, nobody will get hurt except in the pocketbook. Where are my clothes?" Emily brought out his business suit. "Not them," he said irritably. "My working clothes. I've got a lot of dirty work ahead before I'm through. They stole the clothes I had, but they'll all pay." Carson was cross. Barney saw it and remained in the background, not daring to offer a suggestion. Sobbing in a dry, hysterical way, Emily collected an outfit of old clothes. Carson rolled them into a bundle, picked up 3 gold pieces from the pile on the table, then rose to go. "Don't let a soul know I've been home," he cautioned. "I'll be back." His words were cut short by a loud, insistent knock on the rear door. Emily gasped. Neither Carson nor Barney was armed, yet both made suggestive gestures with their right hands. Carson stepped to an inner door and let himself into a small pantry, nodding to the others to admit the visitor as he did so. Without thinking about Carson's suit draped over a chair or the money on the table, Barney opened the door. Hemerson stood on the steps. Behind him was Nucker. "Howdy, Hemerson," greeted Barney cheerfully, not deigning to notice Nucker. "I hear Carson is back. Better tell him I'm here. It's important I see him at once," spoke Hemerson in his crisp official tone. Barney glanced meaningfully at Emily, but did not catch her eye. She was regarding Nucker with an imploring look. The sight whipped his rage into action. To control himself, he faced the sheriff. "Where are you referring to when you say Bart has returned?" parleyed Barney, his thoughts racing in search of a saving loophole. "He was seen to enter this kitchen not 15 minutes ago," replied Hemerson, eyeing the suit of clothes and the coins on the table. Also the note that lay beside the money. Emily seemed frozen in the attitude she had taken when the sheriff entered the kitchen. In a vague way, she was hoping that Nucker's presence meant he was keeping his promise to help her father. Barney stepped to the table, picked up Carson's note, and dropped it in the fire. The money he placed in Emily's purse. Then he faced the sheriff. "Hemerson, I always figured you had good sense and eyesight until tonight. Here I've been all evening trying to cheer Emmy out of her troubles and helping plan a scheme to make this lonesome bunch of money go a long way. Now you come butting in with more trouble. Haven't you any gentlemanly consideration for helpless women? If Bart's in this house and you can find him, you sure can do more than I give you credit for doing." Turning to Emily, he continued, "Now, Emmy, if you'll just give me a bit of paper, I'll wrap up my clothes and be going. They sure needed pressing bad." Nucker leaned toward the sheriff and whispered something in his ear. The latter paid no attention. He was weighing Barney's words. "You needn't imagine your fine talk went over my head, Donovan," he said, after a pause. "But this is a case where friendship loses out. As long as I'm sheriff of this county, I'm going after Bud Hardy's murderer, regardless of whom the blow falls on." Emily's lips parted, though no words came. Unthinkingly, she darted an apprehensive look at the pantry door. Hemerson saw and understood. His face looked grim as he crossed the kitchen and opened the pantry. It was a tense moment for all, but as the door swung open, each expectant watcher received fresh surprise. The pantry was devoid of human presence. "Nucker, step out and see if my men outside have noticed anybody trying to leave," rasped Hemerson. Nucker made haste to obey while Hemerson moved over to Emily's side. "Miss Carson, if your father is in this house, it will make the situation far easier if you tell him to come out and give himself up to me. If he doesn't, I shall search the place tonight. I haven't the least doubt about it. You officers have less sympathy than a savage dog. Search if you are going to, and for all the good it will do," flared Emily. "You mean that your father is not in there?" demanded Hemerson, pointing toward the front rooms. "Exactly. He is not there." Emerson bent one of his searching looks upon her. She met it unflinchingly, and he believed her. Nucker came in shaking his head. Emerson reopened the pantry and inspected its narrow window. A wire screen, attached from the outside, was intact. The neatly kept shelves afforded no hiding place. The floor was bare except for a small square of oilcloth upon which he stood to examine the window. He stepped out and closed the door, leaning against it for a moment while he pulled thoughtfully at his earlobe. Then he beckoned for Nucker to leave and started out. "Donovan." Emerson's head reappeared through the half-closed rear door. "I know you're befriending these people, but take a piece of wise advice. Don't try to interfere with my duties. That's not only legal warning but a friendly tip. Good night." The door closed, leaving Barney and Emily staring at each other in a questioning manner. Emily collapsed into a chair, while Barney turned to the pantry, which he inspected with increasing wonderment. "It sure beats me," he breathed, stepping back into the kitchen. Emily placed one hand over her lips as a sign for silence, at the same time beckoning him to her side. "There's a cooler under the pantry floor," she whispered. "Papa made it a long time ago for the hot days. I get into it through a trap door. The oilcloth is nailed to the trap to keep dust from falling through the cracks. Papa's hid himself in that. Keep real still till they go away." Outside, Emerson and his deputies circled the cabin repeatedly, but their flash lamps failed to reveal any evidence that Carson had made his escape. Posting 2 guards for an all-night vigil, the sheriff went to the assay office to telephone. Within the kitchen, Emily and Barney kept up a desultory conversation for almost an hour. Then Emily tiptoed to the rear door and threw the bolt. Her next move was to see that the front door was also securely fastened. While she was doing this, Barney covered the pantry window with a blanket. Trembling with eagerness, Emily raised the trap. Barney, standing in the doorway, heard her gasp and moan. "What's the matter?" he whispered. She turned her face pale and frightened, but did not speak. Then she went limp. Barney bent forward to look and gaped in astonishment. Instead of any cooler box, he was peering into what seemed like a deep, yawning pit of blackness. Chapter 8. "Oh, Barney, this just makes me sick." Barney patted the sobbing girl's head tenderly and studied a moment. "Emmy," he whispered when a feasible plan took shape in his mind, "you asked me to prove your father absolutely innocent. I'm going to do it tonight. Tell me, where do you keep a lantern or a flash lamp?" The words rallied her. A few minutes later, Barney, armed with a flash lamp, lowered himself into the hole. The light revealed his head about 10 feet below her. "Close the trap, Emmy," he called, glancing up. "Looks like I'm in a drift. I'll soon find out. In the meantime, get some sleep for yourself. If I discover anything serious, I'll let you know as soon as I can. If you hear 4 taps on the floor, slow-like, you'll know it's me." With a wave of his hand, he passed from sight. Emily watched until the reflection of his light was no longer visible, then closed the trap. She did not go to bed, however, choosing to sit in the darkened kitchen till she learned the best or the worst. Daylight came, but no Barney. The first tinge of dawn above the east ridges found him slipping noiselessly into the assay office. Emerson sat in the swivel chair, his feet on the desk, making up for his lost sleep. Barney gained his room without waking the sheriff. As he closed the door, he espied a telegram at his feet. The message was from Middleman, and informed him in a few terse words that he was to recognize Nucker's orders without question, and that a new assayer would relieve him on the first. He tossed his hat in a corner, extracted a pencil from his pocket, and reclined on the bed, but not to sleep. According to the telegram, tomorrow would be his last day with the Malta Mining Company. Yet he was not conscious of regret. On the contrary, a subtle feeling of relief soothed him. Only his discoveries since leaving Emily served to depress him. He had not located Carson. Nevertheless, what he did see completely squelched the remotest hope for Carson's innocence. He had lacked courage to carry his knowledge back to Emily. Far better, he decided, to let her worry through the night in uncertain hope than to tell her the inexorable truth. Yet he nursed a hope that something reassuring might turn up before morning. Scanlon came in just before the whistle blew, but said nothing until Hemerson woke up and hurried out. "Have yez seen Bart, lad?" he asked in a loud whisper. Barney answered with an almost imperceptible nod. "Where is he now?" "I haven't the least idea, Scanlon." "Well, lad, yez had best find him quick. The news be out that he's around the mine. An ivory miner's son av them have sworn to lynch him." "Holy murder!" exclaimed Barney, leaping to his feet. "'Tis murder all right, but domned unholy I'm thinkin'. But yez wanted to know about Hogan. He's that superstitious he goes to Frisco Ivory onct in a while for to have a fortune-teller give him a tip on his luck. Yez could. Oi'll have to be goin', lad. The boss is headed this way." When Scanlon left, Barney's thought-inspiring pencil worked overtime. He heard Knucker enter and make an appointment for a long-distance talk with Middleman. Allowing a reasonable time to pass, he then picked up a hand mirror and went into the office. Knucker greeting him with a scowl intended to intimidate. "I've telegraphic instructions to give you the safe combination. Here it is." Barney pulled down the desktop halfway, then held the mirror so that it reflected the inner surface of the top. In the mirror, Knucker saw a strip of paper bearing the figures and formula of the combination. "That's all. We'll see to it that the combination is changed on the first," sneered Knucker. "No, it is not all. You will please open the safe, inventory its contents, and give me a signed receipt," demanded Barney. "Humph. Just because you and the rest of your clique in this camp are thieves, you imagine I'm one too, eh?" Knucker's tone would have enraged a Quaker. "Am I addressing a gentleman or a common bully?" asked Barney, his temper well in hand, though the glitter of his eyes outstared the larger man. Knucker grabbed the chair arms to rise, his mouth working over unuttered words. A footfall on the porch caused him to relax. He plucked at his unshaved chin as Hemerson entered. "You're the right man at the right time and place, Sheriff," cried Barney. "Please bear witness while I check the contents of the assay safe." Thus circumvented in his aggressive spite, Knucker acknowledged the carefully checked inventory, signing a receipt with ill grace. An idea came to Barney as he returned to his room. He opened the north window, then, donning his hat and coat, he went out through the office, locking his door as he left. Outside, he made sure that no one was watching his movements, and crawled back into his room through the open north window. Eavesdropping under other circumstances would have been repugnant to his sense of fairness. With a man's life at stake, however, a life upon which depended Emily's happiness, he felt justified in his action. Hemerson was at the telephone, conversing on official business. When he hung up, he told Knucker that he would be gone for 2 or 3 hours, and if anything turned up, to notify the deputies at Carson's cabin. After Hemerson's departure, an interval of silence ensued. Then Barney heard Knucker's heavy tread move to the front door and close it next. He approached Barney's door and tried to open it. From there he went to the furnace room and laboratory. Following these strange movements, the telephone bell jingled. Eyes sparkling, Barney held his breath for fear of missing the number Knucker called. There was a short pause, then Knucker's low, yet distinct, "Lo, Matt, you buff? Take a ride at 1 o'clock, I gotta see you." "You know, Jim." "Sure, same place. Goodbye." Barney fairly hugged himself as Knucker hung up and tramped out of the office. When the big fellow was far enough away, Barney exited through the window and went after his pony. 10 minutes later, he was galloping like mad toward Moyna. Emily could scarcely drag one foot after the other as she prepared breakfast for herself and Barney. Worried by the uncertainty occasioned by Barney's non-return and exhausted by the night's experience, She was praying that some miracle would snatch away the gloom and return her father safe and sound. The minutes lengthened into an hour, then 2, yet Barney failed to come. A rap at the rear door sent her into fresh panic. Knucker's coarse good morning greeted her when she opened it. He stepped inside deliberately. She did not offer him a chair but remained by the door, waiting for him to speak. "Did your father show up yet?" he inquired, leering his conception of a smile. Emily shook her head wanly. "I guess you must know by this time that he will be lynched when he does show up," said Knucker with brutal plainness. Emily's face blanched. She leaned against the doorpost to keep from falling. "Why?" she gasped. "Oh, the miners are all dead sore because he killed Bud Hardy." Emily's indrawn breath hissed through her clenched teeth, her fingers intertwined in frantic agitation. For a moment her mind seemed blank. "Now I happen to know where your father is hiding," volunteered Knucker patronizingly. "Fact is, I'm protecting him. I couldn't afford to tip my hand in front of the sheriff last night, but I had everything fixed beforehand. That's the reason he made such a slick getaway. If you want to see him, I'll take you out as soon as it's dark tonight, you see. He dasn't come in or show his face any more till this hullabaloo dies out." Knucker had struck the winning note in his lure song, for Emily replied without hesitation, "To be sure I will go. I simply must see him just as quick as I can. I'll be ready." "All right. You've got 2 horses in your corral. You can loan me one. Then we can ride out of camp like we're taking an evening jaunt. Nobody will wise up to our real purpose at all." And Knucker departed, highly pleased with himself over his arts of deception. Chapter 9. Barney's pony was a mass of lather when he reached Malta. He stabled it, arranged for a fresh horse should he need one on short notice, then sauntered toward Hogan's saloon. He had covered the 20 miles between the mine and Malta with every ounce of speed his pony was capable of making, in order to have an eye on Buffalo Hogan and the 1 o'clock appointment, wherever it was to be kept. As he strolled down Main Street, with its alternating stretches of cement and plank sidewalks, its odd blending of pioneer crudeness with modern architecture, squat frame buildings with dingy false fronts sandwiched between stately structures of brick and stone. As he passed door after door, he could not help but notice the somber-faced men gathered here and there, in pairs, in small groups, in large crowds. Some psychic influence was astir in those murmuring, frowning clusters of rough humanity. Far down the street, where Hogan's electric sign loomed high and large above its many competitors, Barney could see a crowd of unusual proportions. Automobiles and saddled horses lined the curbs, with little space to spare. An 8-horse team, drawing an empty wagon and trailer, came up from the railroad yards and swung skillfully into a clear space ahead of Barney. 2 men burst from a saloon entrance to greet the teamster. The single word, "Carson," reached Barney's ears as he came abreast of the trio. Then the bell horse shook itself, the violent jangle of bells and clattering harness drowning whatever else was said. He passed beneath the stationary awning of the Malta Opera House, where large lettered posters, still damp with fresh paste, adorned the billboards. Barney, his mind concentrated upon his errand, gazed at them without comprehension. Not until he was a block away did their significance penetrate his thoughts. He hurried back to read them carefully. Tonight, the 3 marvels. The marvelous Madame de la Cire, mind reader extraordinary, foretells futures, reveals pasts. The marvelous Professor Slate, peerless prestidigitator, mystifying magician and illusionist. The marvelous and only Deceptin, the man with 80 faces, greatest one of all impersonators. The marvels themselves emerged from the theater and struggled through a circle of eager, clamoring urchins while he was reading. He glanced at them appraisingly, then finished the press accounts of their remarkable entertaining abilities. A daring scheme germinated in his mind, unpenciled. It grew into a well-defined plan. He wheeled so abruptly, two girls behind him were almost swept from their feet. Shouting an apology over his shoulder, he started in pursuit of the show people, overtaking them at the door of their hotel. Breathlessly, he requested a private interview. "There's money in it for you, and a good man's life at stake," he panted as they stared at him skeptically. A sharp command in a foreign tongue by the woman won him consent from the men who escorted him into the hotel. When the four were seated behind locked doors, Barney broached his subject. "Are you people willing to give a private seance after your regular show?" he asked. "Provided, of course, that my proposition and terms meet with your approval," he added, noting their dubious looks. "We are open to any paying engagement that will not conflict with our bookings," replied the dapper little man who had been introduced as Professor Slate. "Well, gentlemen, and pardon me, the lady, I desire to stage an entertainment for the especial benefit of this town's most prominent character, but please understand, it's a strictly confidential affair. No advertising in advance. As to your pay," Barney paused to deliberate. His slender capital had been banked with an eye to the future. Once spent on his present project, there were no chances of reclaiming it. On the other hand, he would be staking his all against an invincible crook. But what was mere gold as compared with the life of Emily's father? He rose above his hesitation. "I'll guarantee you $100 apiece and foot all expenses myself," he continued. "And in case you have a bum night at the show house, I'll try and do better by you. Shall I go on?" "By all means," urged the woman, who did not wait for the others to answer. The three hitched their chairs closer to Barney. In a few brief sentences he outlined his plan, and at the close of the conference they expressed themselves more than pleased to be of service. Barney advanced money for special necessities and left the arranging of a private room in the hotel to their professional judgment. He bowed himself out, promising to return before showtime with another interested party. He next visited a friendly attorney, to whom he made known his scheme for breaking Buffalo Hogan's power and restoring peace at the mine. He left in high spirits. The lateness of the hour surprised him. So intent had he been upon his new idea, he had entirely forgotten the rendezvous he had set out to spy upon. Everything now depended upon speed. Traveling by horse was out of the question, and he hurried to the nearest garage. "Let her out to the limit," he ordered of the chauffeur whom he hired, and that individual obeyed to the extreme of recklessness. Without a single meet, they careened up the cannon, whipping around curves, dashing through lanes of dense undergrowth, roaring up grades, streaking along narrow benches of roadway where the least skid would mean death at the bottom of the gorge. Within a half-mile of the mine, when they were taking a downhill grade, a willow-screened curve almost on two wheels, the bent form of old Pap Kraus stepped into their path not 10 yards ahead. The chauffeur operated the horn and brakes simultaneously, but with the downhill momentum and no chance to turn out, he was helpless. The speed was not checked in time to save the fear-dazed old man. Barney leaped from the car and knelt anxiously beside the senseless figure which the fender had tossed aside. He made a hurried examination. No bones seemed broken, no cuts were visible. Nothing worse was apparent than a swelling lump on the weather-beaten forehead. He slipped one hand in next to the old man's heart. It was still beating. "Help me place him in the car, driver. I don't believe we did worse than knock him unconscious." As Barney spoke, old Pap's eyelids quivered, then opened. "Well, Pap, how do you feel?" asked Barney cheerfully. Kraus regarded the two with a mystified stare. "You know me, don't you, Pap?" coaxed Barney, thinking the old man was suffering another demented spell. Pap hitched himself into a sitting position and studied the faces of both men. He felt of his head and fingered the bruise. "'Pears like I know ya, young feller," he said, squinting at Barney. Who are ya?" It was Barney's turn to stare. In all his time at the mine, he had never heard Kraus speak in his present tone of voice. "Oh, now I'm rememberin'," the stope caved. "But wuff's Bart and Peters and Canby and the rest on 'em? Did they git clar?" Barney could have shouted for joy over Pap's words. It meant that after 5 years the old man's mind had come back. It meant another key to the long-hidden mystery, revelations that would add another blast beneath Hogan's pedestal of imperialism, and would perhaps bring Carson out of crime's shadow unscathed. "We don't need to go farther, driver," he announced. "Just run your car over to the cabin you see on the left. I want you to stay there with Pap until I come back. If anybody happens by while I'm gone, use your wits. Don't let a soul question him. Send them on their way in a hurry." With Kraus thus temporarily taken care of, Barney struck out for the assay office on foot. When he reached it, he discovered the obese form of Isaiah Middleman waddling toward the mine in company with Nucker. He glanced in at the office, where Harper and Sims were in close conversation. "Anything new developed yet?" he asked. Harper's reply was a laconic negative. "The old man have anything to say?" "Inquired after you is all. None of us knew where you were. He didn't seem to care much." Barney hurried away to find Scanlon. "And where have yez been, lad?" Scanlon asked anxiously when they met. Barney told him as briefly as possible, adding, "You must come with me as soon as you get off. I need your help. Come straight to old Pap's cabin." "I'm with ye, but tell me, lad, have yez seen Bart since last night?" "No, I've really been too busy." "Why?" "He was seen in the crick bottoms this morning, and the byes is huntin' him like hounds. If they find him first, there's nothing that'll save his neck. I'll see Emmy, maybe she knows. Anyway, he'll not hang if I can get a running start. Don't forget, though, Pap's at 6. Barney started for the Carson cabin, realizing that in his excitement he had overlooked both breakfast and dinner. Emily's greeting was somewhat cool when he entered the kitchen. In answer to his first question, she said that no word from her father had reached her since his strange departure. Inspired by his successes, Barney kept up a flow of cheerful conversation while she prepared his supper. She listened with little or no comment. While he was eating, she told him what Nucker had proposed to do for her. It had a sobering, silencing effect upon him. He toyed with his coffee spoon for a long time, his eyes upon his plate. "And you are actually going to your father with that man?" His tone, rather than his words, aroused her stubbornness. "I certainly am," she retorted. "Well, Emmy, I know it's useless to argue with you, but when it's all over, I'm hoping you may feel just a wee bit mistaken. I vowed to clear your father. I'm going to do it. Yet you won't trust me. Now you're selling out to the worst enemy you've got. You're not only selling yourself, but your father's life and honor. Not another word, Barney Donovan. If you are going to show your petty jealousy of a man who is honestly helping Pop and me, I'll not listen to you. What are you doing to keep your word? You're never around when you are needed. With your own lips, you tell me you've been hobnobbing with show people right when Papa is wandering about with his head injured. Maybe he's sick and hungry. You know these dirty miners are just itching to hang him the minute he shows his head, and yet you go chasing off to Malta at the most critical time. If you haven't faith enough in me to trust me with Nucker, you had better cut loose now. I can take care of myself." Emily was scathingly indignant, and it brought a noticeable droop to Barney's shoulders. He stood up, regarding her with a wordless, soul-hurt look. "All right, Emmy. I'll not bother you any more. I'll do my share without interfering with your plans. I'll say good afternoon." He hesitated slightly, then extended his hand. "And for fear it's goodbye, let's shake hands like good friends." The tears were rising with overwhelming force. Barney passed out the door in a blind stupor, and when the door clicked shut, Emily rushed to her bed to sob out her misery unchecked. Chapter 10. Fortunately for Barney, his mind was not permitted to dwell upon his love troubles long. He noted that the sheriff's guard at the Carson cabin had been doubled. He wondered if the incriminating passage beneath the cabin had been discovered. When he came in sight of the assay office, Middleman and Knucker were just entering. He swore roundly, for he was anxious to get to his room at once without being disturbed. He overcame the difficulty by means of the north window. Once inside, he listened to make sure that his entrance had not been heard in the office. He heard Knucker leave, and then Middleman's choppy, choleric voice berating someone over the telephone. Some newcomer trod heavily into the office as Middleman rang off, and Barney would have turned to accomplish his original purpose had not the voice of the watchman held him at the door. "Howdy, Middleman. Can I have a private word with ya?" greeted Cyanide from the porch door. Middleman, still panting from his wordy tirade at the phone, settled into the swivel chair and blinked at his caller. "How do you do, what is your name?" he rumbled. "Sutter's my name, Bill Sutter," answered Cyanide, advancing to the desk. "Glad to see you, Sutter. You are welcome to a private interview if your business is important. You are the night watchman, are you not?" "Yep, that's me." "Very well. What is your trouble, if it is trouble?" "Wall, I dropped in to see ya on this here robbery question," replied Sutter. "I've been doin' a little scoutin' on my own hook. I don't reckon you'd grudge me a life-size grub steak if I get that bullion back for ya." Sutter leaned awkwardly over the desk as he finished speaking. Middleman hitched his chair forward, rubbing his fat palms together beneath the desktop. The eavesdropper in the next room trembled with suppressed excitement. "And you have found out where it is, who took it, and how it was taken?" inquired Middleman in a purring tone. Sutter stared at the ceiling for an instant, then fixed his disconcerting eyes full on the president's face. "Yep," he replied. Again the swivel chair's pudgy occupant rubbed his hands, his face beamed. "That's fine. And was it anyone around the mine?" Sutter wagged an affirmative, his eyes glittering in a way that gave Middleman an inexplicable chill. "Ah, and it was." Middleman leaned well forward to better catch the reply to his unfinished question. "What'll be coming to me if I tell you?" The president settled back heavily, frowning his annoyance at the unexpected reply. "You will receive the reward which the company has offered and advertised, $5,000. And do I get all that money if I only tell where them bars is hid? If you know who took the gold." "Why are you asking such nonsensical questions?" snapped Middleman. "Look-a-here, Middleman," flared Sutter in a metallic tone. "I ain't no hand for gassing. I've played cards straight from the deck for more'n 40 years. The president fidgeted, sketching aimless figures on the desk blotter. "Now I'll just toss my hand on the table, and you're welcome to play against it as hard as you please." He paused, striving to catch the other man's eye. "I can tell you how the stuff was taken and who took it, but I won't," he continued, when Middleman failed to look up. "I can show you the bullion, not an ounce missing and inside of 24 hours, but it'll just cost you a 20% rake-off." Middleman sat erect with a suddenness that threatened to capsize his chair. You! Apoplectic symptoms rendered further utterance impossible at the moment. Sutter waited, silent, unperturbed. "So you're the scoundrel who did that telephoning," shouted Middleman finally. "Why, I ought to call in the sheriff without another word." "All right, suit yourself. But just let me give you a little advice. If you're hankering right hard after that bullion, don't be so all-fired anxious to bust them buttons off in that calico vest of yours." Middleman fingered his collar and mopped his temper-heated face. He was not intimidated, but the blazing eyes of Cyanide were hard to meet. "Just repeat your proposition," he requested in a calmer tone. "There ain't much to repeat, mister. You give me $20,000 in cash and a promise not to arrest me any time. And I'll take you straight to where them ingots are planted. $20,000. Middleman puffed, swelling like a powder pigeon. The baggy pouches beneath his protruding eyeballs twitched spasmodically. His fat lips sagged apart. He even forgot to chew the unlit cigar which hung from them. His first attempts to speak produced animal-like snorts. "Then you go plumb. 20 thou, you infernal idiot. I'll have you arrested for extortion blackmail this very minute." Barney longed to snicker. He regretted his inability to watch the extraordinary proceedings in the office. "Well, Mr. Middleman, you can just sit there and holler till your guzzler's dry. I ain't got no more to say unless you're willing to divvy the pot. I'll put you onto the stuff at my price, but I ain't telling nobody who did it, Saba." Middleman compressed his lips and drummed on the desk. "Don't you figure on finding it," continued Cyanide, "'cause it's planted so slick that hell'll melt it before your folks get a smell. Even them that took it ain't knowing where it's gone to. But just give me my price and you can have 'em all pronto. If you don't come across, I'll close my trap and you'll be out the whole wad." "What are you saying, partner?" Sutter leaned over Middleman like a mountain lion tensing its muscles for a spring. The turkey red in the president's flabby cheeks faded to dingy gray. His features became a study in changing expressions. In the bedroom, Barney waited for the reply with bated breath. "Get a chair and sit down, Sutter," sputtered Middleman, struggling to control his voice, "and let me explain some points you have apparently overlooked." Sutter relaxed but remained standing. "Why not come clean with your information? Surely you don't consider $5,000 a despicable sum, do you?" "I've talked more now than I'm used to saying," snapped Sutter in a tone of finality, backing toward the door. "Then I defy you. I'll order your arrest at once." Middleman's voice again ran the ascending scale. "Say, mister, if you knew me better, you wouldn't waste no time trying to call my hand. I'll call your bluff, though. I'll make you talk." "Huh. The feller that can make Cyanide Bill talk ain't been born yet. If you ain't ready to agree in the morning, I'll draw down my bet, and you'll lose the whole outfit." "So long!" Middleman shouted. "Hold on!" But Sutter was striding rapidly toward the mine. Barney favored himself with a grin. His sympathies were with the watchman for the moment. He grabbed for the pencil of inspiration and began to mull over Sutter's statements relative to the hidden gold. Intuitively, he felt that the finale of the climax was close at hand. He dared not trust altogether to old Pap's unstable mind. Windy and the stranger might or might not be the guilty ones, but time was too precious to waste in putting them to any third-degree tests. Carson was undoubtedly a victim gagged by threats. At any rate, he could not be located or depended upon before too late. Under stress of impatience, Barney struck fist against palm. Everything hinged on Buffalo Hogan and the possibility of Madame de la Cire securing priceless information by means of her arts. If that failed, Barney pocketed his pencil so savagely that it went clear through the vest lining. Failure was not in his vocabulary, he assured himself. Middleman was still in the assay office, and Barney, impatient to get into action, exited through the north window once more and started for Pap's cabin by the way of the arroyo. Kraus was asleep when he reached the cabin. "He's been pacing around for a couple of hours, all the time talking about slides and fellers that's been dead for 5 years," explained the chauffeur. "Then he began to complain about his head hurting him. So I fed him a little liquor and made him go to bed." "Fine work," declared Barney, exuberantly cheerful. "Let him sleep. We'll have another passenger with us as soon as the whistle blows, then a nice job of making town at a gate that'll scorch all records." Kraus awoke before Scanlon appeared. The old man seemed none the worse for his accident, and except for that hazy void of 5 years in his memory, he was as sane as ever. Barney prepared him something to eat, after which he ventured a few cautious questions, without results. Kraus remembered Barney's face, but could not recall events or associations later than 5 years previous, when the fatal slide had all but taken his life. With Scanlon, it was different. When the foreman arrived, Kraus greeted him as a long-separated friend. Only Barney's urgent request for an immediate start checked the restored miner's volubility. In town, Barney piloted Kraus and Scanlon into the hotel through a side entrance just in time to meet the Marvels, who were departing for the theater. After the introductions, Barney mentioned his uneasiness over the question of luring the wily gambler into the trap. The rapid-talking seeress begged to have the proposition left entirely in her hands, to which all acceded, although Barney retained a secret lack of confidence in her ultimate success. For this reason, he excused himself and went out alone. The street was thronged with an unusual crowd, attracted there by anticipations far more sinister than the show people's mysticism. Barney realized this before he had traversed 2 blocks. Trouble was in the atmosphere, lurking in the shadows, passing from muttering lips to eager, morbid ears. King Lynch was abroad in ill-fitting disguise, and his worshippers were imbibing the liquid courage that primed them for the coming orgy. Hogan's place was packed. Barney would not have lingered had he not seen jostling rows in front of the bar. He wormed his way forward until he stood against the glass and bottle-littered stretch of mahogany, and almost opposite the famous proprietor. Furtively, Barney studied the man, in no way surprised that he should be known as Buffalo. Standing 6'2" with broad, massive shoulders, long, powerful arms, and enormous hands, he was, to say the least, a formidable giant. But his head was a study in itself. His hair, always close-cropped, grew well down over his high, straight forehead in a V-shaped point, giving him a low-browed appearance. The large, yellow-flecked eyes, washed out blue in color, were set under bristled brows. When angered, his eye pupils contracted to tiny, piercing dots, and the flecks glinted like sparks of electricity. An aggressive chin of abnormal length, also a large flattened nose, were signposts of his combativeness. Even his ears were out of proportion to his bull-like head and neck, and his lips were perpetually compressed in a thin, straight line, scarcely moving when he spoke to anyone. For all his own well-conserved strength, Barney felt a mere pygmy in the presence of the gigantic saloon man. At that moment, 2 extra loud and bibulous patrons on Barney's right invited Buffalo to drink with them, and volunteered information that Carson was at last cornered in the mine. Buffalo accepted the invitation with tolerant nonchalance, breathing an oily expression of sympathy for the hunted man's lot. From the one-sided conversation which followed, Barney gleaned knowledge that set his blood afire with indignation. Carson was to be hanged at daylight, even at the cost of a pitched battle with Hemerson's posse. Someone shouted, "All aboard for the big show!" And with a rebelled uproar, 2/3 of the crowd surged streetward, bound for the opera house. Barney, his eyes registering righteous wrath over the mob's intentions, was unconsciously staring at Hogan, yet his thoughts were swiftly groping for some means of forestalling the coming tragedy. Buffalo caught Barney's stare. Quick to sense an antagonist, he stepped forward and leaned over the assayer. "What seems to be your difficulty, young fellow?" he growled through set lips, his great eyes fixed with their most intimidating glare. Barney's muscles grew rigid, his thoughts concentrated upon the speaker, but he offered no reply. The battle of eyes continued until it attracted the attention of all within the saloon. Instantly there came a dead, ominous hush, but for once Buffalo had encountered eyes that would not down before his own. His great chest swelled with inward breath, his knuckles showed white as his hands gripped the edge of the bar. "Oh, I getcha," he sneered through his nose. "You're that milk-fed assayer of Carson's." A dangerous smile flickered an instant at Barney's lips and in his eyes. Beyond that, he made no sign. Buffalo's gaze dropped to Barney's left arm. The latter's right hand rested on the bar. The left was below Buffalo's line of sight. At that unmistakable hint, Barney exposed his left hand without once shifting his eyes. The situation was proving irksome to Hogan. To cover his embarrassment, he glanced impressively at his silent, awe-inspired watchers, then back at Barney. "Say, kid, get next to yourself. Beat it before somebody spanks you." Barney's ears turned bright red, his lips dead white. He craned forward until his face was close to that of the saloon man. "You seem to be something of a kingpin around this town, Buffalo Hogan. Let's see now just how far your authority goes. I demand you to call off this hanging social of yours." Hogan snorted derisively, and onlookers snickered. "There's the door, kid, and you're all together," bellowed Hogan. "Very well, Buffalo. If Bart Carson hangs, I'll kill you in a man-to-man fight, guns, knives, or fists." Barney paused to note the effect of his warning, then strode from the saloon, his own heels making the only sound that was heard. Chapter 11. A tumult of emotions surged in Barney's breast as he walked from Hogan's to the hotel. Sober second thought on his impulsive threat to kill Buffalo did not give him much comfort, and he was anxious to confide in the cooler-headed Scanlon. At the hotel, he was disappointed. Both Scanlon and Krause had concluded to take in the show. He tried to wait until their return and succeeded for 10 minutes. Then his unrest drove him to the theater. There he found that not even standing room was available, let alone locating his friends in the audience. As he started back along the semi-deserted street, his thoughts reverted to Emily and the evil-eyed man in whom she had pinned her trust. In concentrating his energies upon the problem of entrapping Hogan, he had almost forgotten the equally dangerous Knucker. "This is no place for me," he muttered. "Scanlon and the lawyer can watch this end of the game. I belong at the mine." With one of his abrupt turns, he hurried to the hotel, scribbled a note for Scanlon, then secured his pony and galloped rapidly out of town, en route for the mine. Emily found it impossible to define her sensations as evening drew near. Throughout the afternoon, misgivings as to the wisdom of her faith in Knucker lessened the comfort of her anticipation. She prepared supper for Barney at the usual time, confident that his good nature would bring him in spite of their noontime quarrel. When darkness fell without his appearance, she became first alarmed, then angry, leaving a spiteful note where he might see it should he come in after her departure. She seated herself in the darkened kitchen to await Knucker's coming. It was a long wait. She had all but given him up when finally he knocked at the door. She pointed out her father's saddle to him, and while she saddled Goo-Goo herself, she realized that she was equally as restive as the pinto. When she started to mount, Knucker stepped forward to assist her. He was unnecessarily familiar, yet she attributed it to his clumsiness and said nothing, perturbed nevertheless by the odor of alcohol on his breath. One of Hemerson's deputies approached inquiringly. Knucker said something to him in a low tone, and the man returned to his post. Knucker led the way down the Malta road until they passed the Krause cabin. At this point, he turned to his left and followed a trail leading south. Emily was puzzled by the turn when she recalled the report that her father had been seen in the mine only a few hours previous. From time to time, Knucker endeavored to start conversation, but without success. Emily enjoyed her own thoughts better. The ride lasted for miles without interruption. The moon had not yet risen, still she was able to note that they were going higher and deeper into the hills. Finally, Knucker swung out from the tangle of copper-blighted bull-pine and scrub oak and into a heavily timbered canyon. 30 minutes later, he drew up before a cabin barely visible amid the undergrowth. "Well, here we are," he announced in a hoarse whisper as he dismounted. Emily dropped hastily from her saddle for fear he would attempt to help her down. "Go inside and wait," he commanded. "But don't strike a light until I come in. I'll bring your dad after I put these nags where they won't be seen." Although Emily obeyed him, the first suspicion of treachery she had yet experienced crept upon her. The interior of the cabin gave out a dank odor of wildness and unoccupancy. Rodents scurried about unseen. Nucker came in alone and struck a match. In the flare of its blaze, she saw an evil, triumphant smile on his face as he lighted a lantern, which he placed upon a patched, filth-covered table. "Is Papa coming?" she asked, quelling the tremor that tried to dominate her voice. "I called him. He'll be right along. You see, he's careful about showing himself in a hurry. Wants to make sure he ain't being tricked again." Emily buried her hands in the pockets of her sweater and surveyed the room. A dilapidated soapbox and a short log, upended, were the only available seats, and with the table constituted all the furniture. A crude mud and stone fireplace, crumbling with age, was built into the end wall. The 3 small windows were tightly boarded, leaving the stout plank door, through which they had entered, as the only means of exit. Dirt, twigs, and leaves filled the corners and littered the rough board floor. An uncontrollable shiver shook Emily as her eyes came back to Nucker. "Sit down, miss, and rest while we're waiting. There's a few things I'll put you wise to about your dad and this trip of ours." Again Emily shivered, though less violently. She needed no further assurance than his words and manner to convince her she had entered a trap of some sort. Nevertheless, she felt an exceptional presence of mind and seated herself without exhibiting her true feelings. Under pretense of adjusting his belt, Nucker shifted a gun and holster into plain sight and easy reach, then began to talk. "Now, Miss Carson, it is not my intention to go back on my word about helping your father, but there's one thing you've got to promise me before I do my part." "Oh, don't get uneasy," he interposed as Emily darted a frightened look at the door. "Your dad won't be along for a couple of minutes yet, and I want you to get a complete idea of my plan before he shows up." She looked at him searchingly. "To start with, I'll tell you that Carson didn't kill Bud Hardy. Tickles you, does it? Well, just you remember this. There's only one man to go to the front and say so, that's me. Oh, don't get excited. I ain't going to open my face until you say just what I want you to. Is that plain?" During his talk, Emily fell to watching 2 insects that fluttered around the lantern globe. When he paused, she flashed him an indignant look, then resumed her study of the insects. "I can tell you that right now your dad is bottled up in the mine by the sheriff's posse. But as soon as it's daylight, the miners are going to give the posse the run and take care of your dad themselves. And you know, those miners have their own style of handling such cases." Thinking swiftly, seriously, Emily now broke in with, "I don't mind telling you to your face that you are lying. It has been proved beyond all doubt that Papa took the bullion out of revenge and then shot Bud Hardy to keep him from telling what he knew." "Do you really think so?" leered Nucker. "I'm so positive you cannot convince me otherwise," declared Emily with a contemptuous shrug. "Then you don't happen to know that Bud Hardy knocked your dad on the head, swiped his clothes, and chucked him onto a freight train the night he intended to go to Frisco? You don't happen to know that Hardy gave Tuttle your dad's clothes and peddled the gun and watch at Hogan's bar? There's a lot more to the story, but how does that much of it sound to you?" Emily shook her head in a listless manner. "That may be your story, but it doesn't prove that Papa did not take the bullion from the safe himself," she replied. "Well, if they put the noose over another fellow's neck instead of your dad's in the morning, it'll be very apt to loosen that same fellow's tongue, but here, I ain't got time to waste on any gab-fest. If you intend to save your dad, speak quick, give me a promise." "I'll answer you when you tell me what to promise. First, you tell me Papa is here, then that he's in the mine. Which am I to believe? Don't sit there grinning like that. Speak out and let us be getting back before it is too late." Nucker chuckled inanely. "All in good time, chicken," he answered. "We'll go when you promise to marry me, and after we've ridden into Malta tonight. After the marrying squire says 2 equals 1. If you act nice and ladylike, we'll be back at the mine in time to give the big scare a grandstand finish. And if I refuse—" Emily's tone was icy. Why, if you're foolish enough to refuse, right here we stay until your dad's heels no longer touch the ground. Then we'll go back, but you'll be a mighty sorry girl. Lots of people at the camp saw you ride out with me. They think you're ducking before the trouble starts, and when you do get back, I don't think you'll feel much like telling them the truth. And in the meantime, what shall I do with this?" Nucker grunted in genuine surprise. All through the interview, Emily had sat with her hands folded in her lap, but as she coolly put her last question, he saw himself covered with a businesslike revolver. He breathed heavily and licked his thick lips. "Looks like you'd use it fast enough. What's my move to be?" he asked in husky fear. "Toss your gun on the floor behind me." He moved as if to obey, but with a lurch, amazingly swift for one of his bulk, he sent the lantern and table crashing to the floor. At the same time throwing himself sideways toward the wall, the room went into instant darkness. Then followed a wearisome, soul-trying siege. Emily suppressed her breathing with difficulty, straining her ears to catch some sound of her enemy. Not knowing that his actions were identical with her own, neither dared to move for fear of attracting gunfire from the other. The suspense soon became agony. She had leapt to her feet when Nucker smashed the lantern but had not moved since. The slightest relaxation of muscles would have afforded her relief, yet she feared the risk. As the moments of silence dragged by, she felt that she must either scream or collapse. How long the strain lasted she could not tell. Once, hearing a hoarse sneeze, her hopes rose, only to die when no cheering hoofbeats followed. The atmosphere became stifling. She wondered if this would overcome her in spite of her vigilance. A faint creak, then a scraping sound roused her. Rigid, watchful, she held her weapon ready for attack. Suddenly the door opened, closing instantaneously. Dawn was just breaking, and for that fleeting instant, a body was outlined against the lesser darkness beyond the door. Almost without thought, she fired. A loud oath was drowned by the slam of the closing door. Iron rasped against iron. Nucker had made his exit quickly, fastening the door outside. Emily leapt forward, vainly seeking a latch. A volley of blasphemous abuses came to her ears through the thick panels. "Just for that you'll stay there till you rot. I'll plug you the minute you show your head," he cursed. In the silence that followed, Emily sank to her knees with a choking sob. Instead of helping matters, her impulsive shot had made the situation even worse. Now her father would be killed long before she could reach him with news of his innocence. Barney turned his pony loose in its corral below the assay office, then went direct to the Carson cabin. Two deputies, who were still on duty, flashed their lights over him as he approached, but with a cool nod, he passed and entered the kitchen. He rapped on the inner door, calling Emily's name. When a second rap brought no answer, he lit the kitchen lamp to discover her note. For a long time after he read it, he stood with one leg flung over the corner of the table, mechanically tearing the note into tiny bits and allowing them to sift through his fingers. His face appeared haggard, his eyes strained, a look accentuated by fatigue and loss of sleep. If he had only had the least inkling of her whereabouts, he would have gone in pursuit. He would have brought her back even if he had to kill Nucker to accomplish the rescue. At length he sighed and, after extinguishing the lamp, stumbled wearily out the door. He had not realized how tired he was until he read that discouraging note. Out in the cool night air, under a deputy's curious eyes, memory of other work to be done within a diminishing period of time swept all heartaches aside. Once again his unconquerable spirit blazed into action and sent him swiftly toward the assay office. The building was deserted when he entered, but instead of going to his bedroom, he entered the furnace room and fumbled about in the dark. Later, armed with a pick and shovel, he passed out through the office and was soon lost to view in the creek bottoms. Chapter 12. As the stars dulled before the advance of dawn, An unusual influx of mounted men was noticeable above and below the mine property. An occasional auto also drew up within pistol shot of the mine settlement, its grim-faced passengers, close-tongued, heavily armed, slid from their seats and disappeared, ghost-like, into the gray gloom of the undergrowth. Even at the mine, an undercurrent of disquiet was manifest. Night crews neglected their work to gather in whispering groups and to cast malevolent glances at any deputy who attempted to draw near. Hemerson's men were outnumbered 10-1, seeming like stray watchdogs amid droves of wolves. Middleman, unsuspicious of the coming clash, intent only upon the lost bullion, rose with the first streak of daylight and made a round of the surface workings, reaching the assay office in an irritable frame of mind. He telephoned to the boarding house for Nucker, nearly exploding when told that the superintendent was not in his room, nor had he occupied his bed that night. His next call for Harper brought both detectives to him in a hurry. The three were soon involved in a wordy interview that assumed the character of a quarrel. It closed abruptly when Middleman happened to glance out the west window and SB Cyanide Bill's familiar figure on the Arroyo bank. Memory of the watchman's daring proposition swerved Middleman's thoughts into another channel. Calling Harper, he hurried with fat-hampered speed toward the Arroyo. Sutter, hearing him approach, gaped over his shoulder in a vicious stare. "Looks like yo win," he muttered thickly. "Win what?" barked Middleman. "Why, them in oughts, of course." "You found 'em, they're gone," snarled Cyanide. What do you mean?" yelled the president. By this time, the latter, with the detectives at his heels, was near enough to observe the bottom of the arroyo. Instead of the usual scum-covered pool, there was now an expanse of slimy green mud with only a suspicion of water in its center. Middleman gazed from the empty pool to Sutter's puzzled face, then turned to Harper. "Place this man under arrest," he shouted. "I'm overfed on trickery. Take him away." A scornful, thin-lipped smile twisted Cyanide's face. "Jest you change them orders, Mr. Middleman, and get these tenderfeet outer my way. I ain't filched none of your gold, and I ain't intendin' to lessen ya give me a clear title to it. Fur a long spell back I've knowed your and oughts would show up missin' someday, and I was aimin' to sit in on the game fur a grubstake. I knowed all the time them and oughts was cached in that skeeter nest. Now some measly cuss has swiped in oughts pond and all, maybe you did, and it sure topped my hand." Neither Harper nor Sims made a move as they listened to Sutter's declaration. "Are you all dead?" yelled Middleman. "Isn't someone going to obey my order?" Both detectives stepped forward but hesitated when Sutter flashed an ugly-looking six-shooter into view. "Just one more step and I'll make buzzard grub of the whole crowd. Thar ain't goin' to be no arrestin' take place here. The man that follows me better fetch his own hearse." Middleman was mad, recklessly so. His detectives halted in discreet silence, but the president kept on. "Stand back, Middleman." Cyanide's drawl would have sent old-timers scurrying for bullet-proof cover. "I ain't used to givin' no second warnin'. This here gun'll speak next." But the obese president, seeing nothing, hearing nothing, except the wings of his vanishing gold, kept on. Sutter's gun roared, its shot scorching Middleman's right ear. He stumbled, taking one more step to regain balance. Came another vicious report, and a small furrow opened between his feet. Dirt and grit showered over him. He threw up his hands convulsively, then, reeling, toppled over the bank and rolled down the slope to the pool. Breakfast time came at the mine boarding house, but no breakfast. Yielding to the lure of excitement, the cook and his helper had lingered too long at Malta's joy fountains after the show, and were still lingering, becalmed, befuddled. Noisy, restless miners swarmed at the closed dining room door, some genuinely tired from all-night labor, others excited, the majority more or less drunk, and all hungry. The boarding boss fumed around the kitchen in an effort to pacify the clamoring horde. Cyanide Bill's 2 shots came to the distressed man's relief. The quivering needle of attention swung instantly a royal ward as those 2 whip-like reports cut the air. Everybody started for the assay office on the run. Opposite Carson's cabin, their attention was again diverted. Carson's pony came trotting up the trail. Nucker was in the saddle, reeling in wide circles like a man drunk. When crowd and pony met, the rider toppled and slid limply from the saddle, dead. In the same breath, a man came running from the shaft house at top speed. "Carson's out, he's escaped," yelled the runner. Those who had stooped to examine the shattered, blood-drenched right leg of the dead man shouted, "It's Carson's work, the murdering cur! Hunt him down, every man of you." A familiar sombrero was exposed an instant at the rear of Carson's cabin. In a twinkling, the mob cry rose from many lungs, spreading like a breeze-fanned grass fire. "He's in his cabin. Bring him out. Tear it down. Burn it. Hang him up," were the yells that swelled in volume. The 2 deputies took a defiant stand on the cabin porch, but with derisive yells, the mob spread into a skirmish line, its flanks sweeping around the cabin like a monster claw. The foremost runners dashed for the rear door, only to come to a startling halt. Barney, arrayed in Carson's clothes and armed with 2 automatics, suddenly appeared on the steps from within. But the pause was only transitory. As soon as they realized that Barney was all they had to contend with, they prepared to rush him en masse. He tried to speak and was instantly hooted into silence. He raised the automatics and trained them on the leaders. Angry growls greeted his act. Far from being cowed, they were doubly enraged because of his interference with their revenge. A rock whistled past his head, splintering the door panel behind him. Another struck him a numbing blow on his left shoulder. His face blanched from pain, yet he smiled, a smile of stubborn defiance. His grip slowly tightened on the gun butts. A dozen hands appeared above the heads of the mob, each containing rocks or bricks. Barney fired 1 high shot as a warning. The hands dropped, but here and there men began to draw guns. These were immediately whisked from view by cooler heads who had no wish for Barney's life. The rock throwers let loose their volley, hitting Barney twice. He let 2 shots kick up the ground at their feet, then elevated the muzzles, resolved to make the rest of his shots collect their toll. Unseen by him, a lariat whirred through the air from one side, dropping neatly over his head, clamping his arms to his sides. The coup was greeted with yells of profane glee. Willing hands seized the lariat, and helpless Barney was jerked from his feet to be dragged ruthlessly from the steps and over the rocky ground. Then the majority of the bloodlusting mob surged toward the kitchen door. Chapter 13. Emily's despair was fleeting. Reason brought her to her feet with redoubled determination. Daylight had grown, and enough light now streamed through cracks to enable her to move about freely. As a chance of escape, the door was hopeless. The windows equally so, without bar or sledge to remove the firmly spiked boards, and nothing appeared available. She turned to the fireplace, intending to dig loose one of its boulders. A faint streak of light seeping through its back wall gave her a better idea. She sped to the log. Tipping it, she rolled it across the hearth. By rocking it back and forth, she had an effective battering ram. Long minutes of hard, exhausting work, during which time she was nearly choked by dust, bruised and cut by falling stones and chunks of dry mud. Tested to the limit of her strength, she emerged into the open air. She staggered twice around the cabin, but Nucker was nowhere to be seen. Wholly unnerved by fear that he had gone, taking her pinto with him, she sank sobbing to the doorstep. "Oh, Daddy, Daddy, how can I?" A shrill neigh interrupted her wailing cry. With a glad hello, she sped in the direction from whence it came. 100 yards down the trail, she found Gugu nickering his joy. Knucker had evidently turned him loose, but the bridle rein having caught on a broken limb, the Pinto had made no attempt to break away. No spurs were needed on the homeward trip. Ears flattened, nostrils spread, eyes flashing, the Pinto heeded neither rocks nor ruts. 2 miles were covered before Emily was able to locate herself. Then, with sinking dread, she realized the miles of tortuous trail which lay between her and the mine. Knucker's gloating prophecy rang in her ears, tore at her heartstrings. Unable to banish the fear that a life depended entirely upon her, she gave Gugu full rein. Mile after mile slipped beneath the animal's flying hoofs. A gentle breeze blew in her face. On it the echo of Sutter's shots drifted far. She thought her heart stopped beating when those portentous sounds broke the morning stillness. By trail, a mile remained to go. Cross-country, a fraction of time and distance might be saved. Reining the Pinto sharply to her left, she urged him to greater speed. His blood afire with the lure of the chase, Gugu went crashing over a brush-littered knoll, leaped a dry wash that would have checked a veteran, and dislodged a miniature avalanche of small pebbles as he charged up the last ridge. A third shot barked as he reached the top. One glance at the mob around her cabin revealed the stride of tragedy below. Emily screamed. No one heard, except the Pinto, who dashed down to the creek with redoubled speed. In great muscular leaps the animal lunged up out of the creek as if spurred by the 2 last shots. He needed no guiding. Before the brutal rope-wielders were aware of his coming, the Pinto was on them. His teeth caught the foremost man in a vicious nip in the shoulder. The second ruffian went down beneath the racing hoofs. The rest broke and ran in cowardly fear. Emily, her hair gone, her hair streaming, slid from the charging Pinto and sped to the now unconscious victim, who lay face downward in the dirt, lacerated, bleeding, motionless. She turned him gently, then screamed. Middleman's ludicrous descent ended far out in the arroyo bed. As he rolled into that basin of ooze, 5 heads appeared above a clump of bushes halfway down the bank. The detectives and Cyanide stared at them in surprise, only to revert back to Middleman when the latter uttered a spluttering shout. Standing knee-deep in the mass of slimy silt, his expansive body streaked and plastered with green scum, both pudgy hands holding aloft an oblong, mud-covered yellow object. He presented a picture that baffled human description. As the bedaubed president lumbered up the slope, he encountered Windy Tuttle and the stranger coming from the clump of bushes. Both men were holding their hands in position to suit the attitude of Hemerson, Scanlon, and Kraus, who followed with drawn guns. The stranger slouched along sullenly. Windy moved with a swagger. When he recognized Middleman, he guffawed. "Morning, Middleman," he drawled. The president stared hard at the quintet. "What seems to be your trouble, Middleman?" grinned Hemerson. "My trouble?" "Oh, hello, Sheriff," responded the president after another searching look at the 5. "Why, ahem, no trouble at all. Come to think it over, I wouldn't have missed that shooting entertainment for the world. I happened to land where the stolen ingots are cached." The stranger glared malevolently at Windy, who chuckled in an idiotic manner. "What is the meaning of all this Wild West parade?" demanded Middleman. Before an answer could be given, Barney's first shot rang out. The detective started up the bank to investigate. Hemerson turned his prisoners over to Scanlon and the president and started to follow. Echoes of 2 more shots galvanized him into a run, which increased when Emily screamed. She had not screamed because of personal danger. The cry was involuntary when she recognized Barney. Hemerson, outdistancing the detectives, was treated to an unusual sight. Emily, knowing that Barney's condition was critical, glanced around for someone to help her. One glimpse of the retreating mob brought her to her feet in a fury. You devil-fostered cowards!" She hurled at them, lacking epithets more fitting to their kind. "You, Spud Foley, come here this instant," she demanded of the nearest man. Out came her revolver when he hesitated. "Come, now cut away this rope quick." And the hulking miner obeyed as a whipped dog might grovel at her feet. His companions had paused to watch, but when the revolver flashed in her hand and Hemerson came running, many began to slink away. "Don't a man of you dare leave," shrilled Emily, noting the movement. "Come here. Donkey Jack, you too, Dead Rock and Blackie, help Foley carry this poor boy to the house. Be careful. Lift him easy. If one of you cowardly brutes hurt him one bit more, I'll shoot and shoot to kill." Though humbled, as ruffians oftentimes are, by the mere presence of a woman, Emily's well-known skill with rifle and revolver had much to do with their obedience. Far different was that motley procession of crestfallen, sobering miners from the cursing, liquor-crazed bullies who, less than 20 minutes previously, were defying law and justice to promote their fancied vengeance. Emily kept close to Barney's side. At the cabin door, she ran ahead to prepare her father's room, but stopped short in the doorway of his bedroom. Her father lay in his own bed. With quick presence of mind, she jerked the door to and led the way to her own room. When Barney, still unconscious, was laid in her dainty bed, she wheeled to those who were crowding the kitchen. "Let me see how fast you would-be assassins can bring a doctor here," she cried. The room cleared in a twinkling as the less morbid ones vied with each other in an effort to be first to obey. The last man shut out, she hastened to build a fire. A call of "Oh, Emmy," took her from this task to find Barney sitting up in bed, poking one finger through his blood-caked hair in lieu of the customary pencil. "Oh, Barney, dear, you must not do that." Is he safe?" interposed Barney, anxiety plain in his eyes. She nodded and gestured for silence. "You must lie still, dear. I'll have warm water soon to bathe your poor head." "Never mind me," he protested, thrilled nevertheless by her term of endearment. "He needs a doctor and you at once. He's in a mighty bad fix, hurt, I mean." Emily uttered a pitying cry and darted for her father's room, only to be interrupted by Hemerson, who had entered the kitchen unnoticed. "Miss Carson, I don't aim to bother you, but please tell me if you know where your father is hiding," he asked. She wheeled, her back to the closed door. All color fled from her face as she studied the sheriff searchingly, distrustful. "I have nothing to tell you," she replied, curbing a temptation to drive him out at the point of her revolver. "I'm sorry, then, if that's the case. My men could get him back to you much quicker if we knew where to look. There's no trace of him anywhere. However, it may comfort you to know that he's cleared from all charges. The guilty men have been caught." The sheriff's explanation trailed to silence. His audience had vanished within Carson's bedroom. Following, he found Emily kneeling by her father's side, uttering throaty cries of pity and affection which the semi-delirious man did not heed. Carson, 2 ribs fractured and highly inflamed from lack of attention, was in critical condition. In one swift glance, Hemerson read symptoms of hunger and exposure. He did not stop to question, but dashed out to fetch medical aid without delay. Chapter 14. 6 people gathered within the Carson kitchen that evening: Hemerson, Middleman, Scanlon, Barney, Emily, and Kraus. Carson was asleep, his injuries dressed, his hunger appeased, and he rested easily. Buoyed up by an eagerness to hear full details concerning Buffalo Hogan's dethronement, Barney and Emily appeared far from exhausted. "Well, Scanlon, you seem to be chief unraveler of these mind troubles. Suppose you start the story going," suggested Hemerson, as eager as the others to know more. "Oi don't mind tellin' of what oi be knowin', but yez must give young Barney credit for pickin' the right strings for me to pull." "'Tis him that got the idea. Oi only did as he told me," answered the foreman simply. Surprised eyes turned to Barney, whose bandaged, court-plastered face was scarcely recognizable. "Aw, let Scanlon tell the whole thing," exclaimed Barney. While I may have doped out some of the ideas, I wouldn't have got anywhere without him. Besides, he's had the fun of bagging the game, and how about Emily now?" "Oh, hush, Barney. Let Scanlon tell what we are all aching to hear about," interrupted Emily hastily. Scanlon took out his pipe, filled it, struck a match, blowing it out immediately as he cast an apologetic glance at Emily, dropped the pipe back into his pocket, then cleared his throat. "Why don't you smoke, Scanlon? Surely you don't imagine I would object," exclaimed Emily. "'Twill help me to talk a bit better, if ye are not mindin', thanks." Scanlon brightened and again produced his pipe. "Oi've been puttin' cards and spades together iver since mornin'," he continued when the pipe was going good, "and Oi'll do the best Oi can at tellin' yez about thim. Maybe Oi'd better begin with the slide. Everybody remembers that, exceptin' Barney, who came since then. Buffalo Hogan were super, with the divil's own luck at gamblin'. Bart, he were only shift boss, but he couldn't kape his fingers off the cards. Oi've watched him play for years, and niver a thing did he win but abuse and hard luck. And on top av being a bum gambler, Bart were too good-natured and willin' to accommodate. And it were not long afore Buffalo had him tight under his thumb, just as he got Bud Hardy and Windy Tuttle, and Jim Kerr, him what came back a week ago callin' himself Knucker, and many another poor divil besides. Buffalo were playin' a long-winded game to get the mine away from the Malta Company. He kept complainin' that the ore were failin' and that the veins were playin' out. As Oi remember, he were mighty anxious to kape all crews out av the west drifts. Hardy and the rest played to his hand ready enough, but Bart began to wake up. Bart, yez may know, were not a bit crooked at heart, but Buffalo played him foul by layin' a couple of sneaky traps, and bellivin' that he were doin' a square favor, Bart stepped into them all unsuspectin'. After that, Buffalo just tells him to either obey orders or go to the pen for what he had done. Bart, the poor divil, saw his fix, but he didn't have an out. Ivory, once in a while there were slides in the west drifts, and when they happened, Buffalo ordered all the crews to the east levels. It were Kerr that caused the slide in B-level stope, and by Buffalo's orders. That's the time Hogan made the first mistake that tripped him. He never told Bart what were to come off, and Bart, not knowin', rushed his whole crew into the stope with timber when the alarm sounded. He were goin' himself for more timber when she went in. How the divil Kerr ever got out alive and unbeknownst to anyone, Oi don't know, and now he's too dead to tell us. Anyway, Bart and Hogan had a big row. Buffalo's quittin' were only a bluff to make Bart super so as to keep him quiet. You see, Bart were ready to fess up and take his medicine, but at the time Emmy's mother were a mighty sick woman, so he kept still for her sake. "But Scanlon, poor Mama never knew Papa was to blame," interrupted Emily. "That be just the reason he kept mum about it, to keep her from havin' to die with bad sorrow in her soul," explained Scanlon gently. "Ye see," he continued, Bart took the super job smiling like, but for 5 years he tried his best to break Hogan's grip. It didn't take Buffalo long to see that things were not going the way he planned, so he schemed to get rid of Bart for good and all. When the scheme began to work, Bart was quick to suspect Hardy and Tuttle. He wasn't quite positive, but to make sure he fired Hardy the first chance he had, then trouble buzzed thicker than bees on a honey thief. Bud Hardy did all he could to stir up hard feelings against Bart around the mine and town, and Buffalo played a cat's paw game of poisoning the company's mind. Scanlon bent a meaningful look upon Middleman, who fidgeted and mopped his face energetically. "You can't blame me exactly," grumbled the president, "with half the prominent men of Malta reporting Carson's trickery and incompetence, and the output dropping worse and worse each year. How was I to know it was not his fault?" "'Tis not for me to say," replied Scanlon dryly. "Anyhow, knowing different, I'll not argue the point. As I was telling, Buffalo played to get Bart out and Knucker in. His gang tried their best to have Bart killed by accident. When that failed to work, Buffalo decided to fix a trap that Bart would fall into and hang himself. He planned the scheme out in secret with Hardy and Tuttle. Then he went to Bart and declared he would call all bets off for the sake of one last favor. Bart pretended to give in, and Hogan told him to tip off the next big cleanup the night before it was shipped. Right there's where Buffalo Hogan's pudding began to scorch. He was so sure of himself he never figured that Bart intended to tip off the shipment to him and warn the messengers at the same time. Neither did Buffalo figure he'd be double-crossed by Tuttle on the showdown, and neither did Windy have sense enough to do any double-crossing till his partner butted in. You see, this partner was a combination peddler and thief, stealing for a living and peddling to keep out of jail. One day he was trying to sell Barney some of his gym cracks and had them spread all over the desk. When he picked them up, he happened to catch the reflection of the combination on the surface of his junk. Next day he had a long talk with Windy. Then the pair of them planned to tap a cleanup themselves. It was an easy trick to do. Windy knew that Buffalo had a secret drift running from Old A Level to that clump of bushes on the Arroyo bank. Not a soul ever spotted the entrance for the way it was covered. Anyway, them two crooks tunneled from this drift to the assay house and rigged up one of the slickest contraptions you ever saw under the closet floor. They could raise and lower the safe, floor, and all whenever they felt like it. Not satisfied with that, they tried to make it look like Bart did the trick. Knowing the feeling against him, the two of them ran their tunnel all the way to Carson's cabin, coming to the surface right under the pantry cooler. Now you can understand how come Bart to disappear so strangely like the night Hemerson had him cornered. The cooler was not nailed tight, and having no support with the dirt gone below, it broke loose when Bart crawled into it and dropped him right into Windy's tunnel. Then old Pap here roiled up the mess still more because of a queer streak he took the night the gold disappeared. Cyanide saw him swipe Barney's gun from the saddle just before Barney started for town, and it was Windy and his partner that caught Pap in the very act of shooting at Carson's back when they were getting ready for their own trick. They were scared when the light went out, so they took the gun away from Pap and snuck up to see if Bart was killed. When they saw him slip out to look around, they hustled into the tunnel and did their job of stealing. Cyanide heard their racket and opened the closet just as the safe was hoisted back to its place. The two thieves then hid the ingots under old Pap's cabin, not knowing that Pap was looking on. Then what does Pap do but carry every last ingot back and dump them in the pool, unbeknownst to anybody but Cyanide. Cyanide was keeping an eye on the game because he had overheard Windy and the peddler plotting the scheme in the first place. And when he saw how slick old Pap's crazy whim was spiking the steel, he tried to pull down a stake for himself without getting anybody in a jam. You can easily see where Bart boosted Windy's chance by firing the lusher for bootlegging liquor to the cruise. The next slip of the cogs was when Bart got notice from Middleman that he was fired himself. His sneaking enemies had been nagging him so long that he was all out of patience. He was getting so upset he imagined Barney was with the others and trying to down him. He went into high tantrums over the notice from Middleman, and forgetting that he had tipped Hogan the word before the shot, he struck out for Frisco to have a final understanding with Middleman. Buffalo had Bud Hardy and Windy Tuttle primed to hold up the morning stage from the mine, and the two scamps were hanging around town all night. Hardy happened to see Bart crossing the freight yards on his way to the depot, and to square his own grievance, he knocked him out with a club, took everything he had, even his clothes, then chucked his body on a northbound freight. Bart's clothes go to Windy, who hides them in Pap's cabin, while Hardy takes all the rest to Hogan. In the morning, Bud and Windy hike for the Narrows, with orders from Buffalo to leave Bart's note as evidence after the holdup. Windy, the old fox, goes through it all innocent-like, and gets just as howling mad as Bud when they don't find any gold on the stage. Then, when they take the news to Hogan, there was a grand falling out among thieves. Buffalo raved like a maniac and swore he'd been double-crossed by everybody. After the row, Bud got sore and talked too much, for which Hogan shoots him with Bart's gun and sticks Bart's watch in Hardy's hand so as to get Bart out of the way for good. Then up steps Barney to solve the key to the whole riddle. There wasn't another way under the sun to make Buffalo talk except that fortune-telling stuff. And you missed the time of your lives by not seeing how clever them show folks did it. Then it was the stolen gold that Windy wanted when he tried to choke old Pap? Put in Barney when Scanlon paused long enough to start. His pipe afresh. 'Twas that, answered Scanlon, testing the pipe's draught with a few preliminary puffs. I've heard some speedy talkers in my day, he resumed, but that little show woman could spake faster'n a burley drill runnin' full pressure. She took to Barney's scheme for bustin' Hogan like a fly to butter, but she were for doin' the trick her own way, and she did. She had that whole bunch A.V. flint-headed miners a-guessin' all through her act. She were blindfolded while one A.V. the professors called for any kind A.V. a question, and the bys were puttin' them over fast. One feller asks, "Beef, where do Oi go from here?" And says she, "Yez are goin' to zee Mr. Hugans to play Z cards, and yez are goin' to be very lucky." Then says she, real solemn-like, "Oi can see a letter on a table in a city that is far away. It is addressed to Mr. Hugan. Oi can only read its message in the crystal at midnight." Buffalo weren't in the house, but he got the news just the same, and swallowed the bait, pole and all. Well, Yez should have seen his actin' in that fortune-tellin' game at the hotel to realize peef what a baby he were for all his bully-raggin'. He were mighty worried over Barney's threat about killin' him, for they were the first thing he wanted the little woman to tell him about. The madame had the room all hung with black curtains and red rugs and snaky-looking jewelry and wooden-faced hoodoos and a table with a big glass marble atop A.V. a darnin' needle and stuck on the table. She made Buffalo sit on one side A.V. the table and she on the other. Then when he asked his questions, she cut loose with her spooky talk. Me and the lawyer and his styny-grafter were hid behind the curtain back A.V. Buffalo's chair, but we could peek through holes and watch the whole show. By golly, 'tis me that thinks Buffalo suffered the tortures av hell while the little madam were tellin' him the stuff she said the gods were lettin' her see. Says she, "A spirit has asked me for permission to spake to Yez, Mr. Hugan." Buffalo looked shaky, but he nodded his head, and the face av Peters without anybody appears on the curtain behind the madame, and gives Buffalo a bawlin' out for killin' him. Hogan were upset bad, but held on to himself till Pap stuck his own whiskers in the curtain and spoke a piece. Then the big bully wilted, but he didn't do no talkin' till poor Canby's spirit showed on the curtain. Then he went to his knees, bawlin' and beggin' like a baby. He offered her all kinds A.V. money to save his soul for him, askin' her to have Peters and Canby and the rest forgive him. But she pretends to be spakin' in a trance until she had pulled the whole story from his ugly heart. Then she tells him that to save his soul he must first square himself with an honest confession. Scanlon ceased speaking, and leaned over to tap out the heel of his pipe in the hearth pan of the stove. "And what did Hogan do after that?" asked Barney, breathless with interest. "Well, to my mind, he wasted some good powder and lead on himself. But I reckon the state's been saved the expense A.V. a justified hangin'." "Did he? Is he dead?" breathed Emily, her eyes widening in horror. Scanlon looked toward Hemerson. "Yes," answered the sheriff. "Hogan went direct to the saloon and locked himself in his room. He died by his own hand and gun 10 minutes before I got there with my warrant." Chapter 15. "There is just one more point I am curious about," declared Middleman, as the party made a motion to break up. "Who drained the Arroyo pool? Was it anyone who knew the bars were hidden in it?" Kraus showed no memory or interest. Emily and the sheriff exchanged puzzled looks. Scanlon squinted wisely at Barney. "I'm guilty of that," confessed Barney. "And if you won't condemn me for eavesdropping, I'll explain how." "To all appearances, young man, I am not qualified to condemn anybody in this case," replied Middleman, not unkindly, a note of sadness in his tone. "Well, I was in my bedroom when Sutter put his $20,000 offer to you. Afterward, I crawled out through a window and headed for Pap's cabin with Sutter's words buzzing in my ears. He told you the gold was hidden where no one could spot it. And when I passed the pool, it occurred to me that water had a surface which left no marks over anything it covered. After I got back from Malta last night, I had to do something to keep awake, so I cut a channel through the gravel bar and drained the pool. It was almost daylight by the time I let the water out, and the lynchers were getting busy, so I discontinued my search until later. In the meantime, you have been lucky enough to find the ingots yourself," concluded Barney with a droll smile. Middleman did not return the smile. "Then it seems that in my stupid ignorance and misinformation I have discharged a valuable superintendent and an extraordinarily bright young assayer. I wonder if it is too late to reverse my decision, especially if I announce that each position will command $1,000 more per year." Middleman's look added weight to his words as he bent a quizzical glance upon Barney. "Before I answer for myself, let me ask what Sutter did. Do I get the reward you have advertised for the return of the gold?" inquired Barney. "To be sure you do," responded Middleman heartily. "Very well, please make your check payable for that amount to the Three Marvels." "Just a minute, lad," interrupted Scanlon, extending to Barney a roll of bills. "Here be the money Yez gave them show people. They refused to accept it. They refused to take a cent for showing up the dirty murderin' robber." Barney eyed the money meditatively. "Did that slide make any widows?" he asked at length. "6, and one of 'em be dead now," answered Scanlon. "Then, Mr. Middleman, just make 5 checks of $1,000 apiece, and payable to each of the 5 widows. That will satisfy me. As for staying on my job," he stole a furtive glance at Emily, "I prefer to wait until Carson gives his answer." Hemerson went out with the president, followed by Scanlon and Krause. Barney would have gone too, but Emily detained him with a question about her father. "How did you come to find him, and why were you wearing his clothes?" "I found him in the mine. The reports in town had it that he was hidden there. So when I drained the pool, I started out to hunt him. The night he disappeared through the pantry is when I discovered the secret tunnel, and I got into the mine through it. He was all in and delirious when I found him, and I packed him on my back as far as the pantry trap, then hoisted him up with your clothesline. After I got him to bed, the proposition of getting a doctor bothered me. I was afraid to leave him alone until I caught the idea of disguising myself in his clothes. In that way, I fancied I could make a dash for help and lure the mob out of harm's way at the same time. I was trying to figure out some means of disguising my face and hair when 2 shots were fired. Then came a lot of yelling in front of the cabin. I grabbed your father's automatic and looked out the back door in hopes of getting the deputies to help, but the gang saw me first and, well, you know the rest." Emily toyed with her fingers in silence without looking up. Barney failed to interpret the sign. He sighed his weariness, both of heart and body, and wished she would say a word in defense of his act, but she didn't, and he reopened the door. "Are you coming to breakfast in the morning?" "Very likely," answered Barney from the back porch. And Barney. Her finger went to her teeth. He paused on the lower step with downcast eyes. "You have kept your word. Are you going to be unkind just because I wish to keep my word too? If I've been unkind, forgive me, you have a perfect right to keep your word," responded Barney sadly as he stepped to the path. "Goodness, Barney," petulantly, "you are awful dense for a man who has just made such brilliant discoveries. Must I tell you again that when you proved Papa absolutely innocent—" She could not say more. A bandaged face bent over her own, her lips were sealed. End of Vanishing Gold by Clarence L. Andrews.